not sure. Let's see. Go monitor. Hey, whatever works for you.
Especially when I got the picture of where the seats were.
please rise for the Pledge of Allegiance?
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Welcome to a brisk and beautiful Half Moon Bay for our Planning Commission meeting for Tuesday, November 28th. Can we get a roll call, please?
Yes. Yes, Commissioner DeMond,
Here.
Commissioner Benjamin,
Here.
Commissioner Evans,
Here.
Vice Chair Holt,
Here.
and Chair Hernandez.
I am present.
All commissioners are present.
Excellent. So the next item on the agenda is to the approval of the minutes from November 14th, 2017. Do we have any comments on the minutes? Jimmy?
Yeah, through the chair, there were some comments that were made at the meeting with respect to Measure D that were referenced in the note, but not necessarily in a way that reflected the point of view of the commenter. I believe that a copy of an email that summarized that went out, and I don't know if we have it, but I'd ask that it be brought into the record as part of our understanding.
Why don't we defer the approval of the minutes until we have a chance?
Future meeting?
Yep.
Fine.
Fine. So, can I get a motion to defer?
one-
Oh, sorry.
Sorry, there's just one typo on
Mr. Ferrera's name is
the
misspelled.
last page. The bullet points under heritage structures, it's, I think it's a rely instead of reply. Yeah, sorry.
I'm sorry, where is that again? Reply.
And
When we
through the
say
chair,
rely.
I had several other comments. I'll share them with staff.
Go ahead, Jimmy.
So I move that we,
Hang on one second. Do you just want to send your notes
I
by
can
email?
I can provide them offline and save the commission time if you're ready for the motion.
Yeah, they're in here.
Like 3 things.
I have several of my own in addition to that.
Why don't we defer until the next meeting? Can I get a motion?
I move that we defer the minutes dated November the 14th, 2017 until the next planning commission meeting.
Second.
Aye.
Aye.
Now we come to public comment. For those of you who have public comments for items not on the agenda tonight, this is your opportunity to speak up. Seeing nobody raising their hand and listening to this lecture, we will close public comments and move on to the first public hearing.
Thank you. The item before you tonight is a Highway 1 signalization project at South Main Street. And for the presentation tonight, we have several presenters. John Dowdy, our Public Works Director, will begin the presentation. Ray Razavi, the city's traffic engineer, will present the project. And Grant, I'm going to choke on how to pronounce your name, Gruber, yes, from First Carbon Solutions is our environmental consultant who prepared the initial study mitigated negative declaration. And so we'll be going through each of their areas of expertise, and then I will have some couple slides at the end regarding conformance with the local coastal program and general plan. Can you go back one? Oh, there we go. That appears to be it. So this is our format, and John is in the ready position. So we'll go ahead and get started with the project background.
Thanks, Jill. Chair and commission members, nice to be here. And hope each of you had a great Thanksgiving and looking forward to the holiday season. With that, I wanted to walk you through a little bit of the background, talk a bit about how we've sort of got to this point, and sort of preface some of the discussions. We've had some comments from various commissioners having some questions. I think none of them were out of the norm or unreasonable questions. What I'd like to do is first sort of say a few things before I get directly to this issue. First, street projects of this nature are a challenge in the first place in terms of defining what the project is, what the impacts are. They're usually designed as in essence, as a mitigation to a certain issue. So from a CEQA perspective, in many respects, they are generally and typically sort of a self-mitigating issue of you've got traffic problems for a signal, you need to address those, and so it's a rather unique project. Beyond that, what's very unique is that only in the coastal zone do you see a discretionary permit required for this type of activity. Nothing wrong with that, it's just places a very interesting challenge to what does that project look like, how do you present it, and what do you show with that. It's just not the norm and not something that is easily dealt with. Compounding the challenge of this project is that we have a funding partner, which is the San Mateo County Transportation Authority, who is funding all of this project if it is approved and moved forward, upwards of $3 million or so for this project, which is probably will not be entirely needed and used. Beyond that, we also have a partner in Caltrans. This is their facility, and so from a challenge perspective, it's not a city-owned, operated, managed street. It's Caltrans, so we have to get their approval for anything and everything we want to do design-wise, and have to get encroachment permits and permits from them. And then beyond that, we have to, in order to move forward with actual final design of the project and doing the engineered design and doing final landscape design and all the materials and things that you would like to see and the community would ultimately like to see, we have to get this approval so we can get a funding agreement in place and allow for the SMCTA money to be paying for all of that work, design, and project management that we need to do. So it's a little bit of, in some regards, a cart before the horse, perspective here from some of your perspective, and I'm sure from the community perspective as well. Now, but that's kind of the place we are. It's a difficult issue. So questions such as, where's staging going to be? A legitimate question. Obviously and clearly, we're not going to place this on any kind of habitat, wetland area, or anything that would be of an issue. We have not got that far to the point of looking at where we will need to and where we'll actually do that work. That will be done in conjunction with final design work and with the contractor of record who's dealing with that. In projects of recent, we've been even using the city yard property there at Stone Pine for some of the work, and it's a very challenging issue around here to find places that are not habitat, not impacted in some way, and would not be an issue, but we're going to have to do that, and we'll deal with that. But those are types of things that in a perfect world you'd have all worked out and dealt with, but in a perfect world we wouldn't have to have this approval before getting the funding from the San Mateo County Transportation Authority. So with that, I'll work more into sort of the background. So this effort goes back quite some time, and really started with the 2009 Highway 1 Traffic Safety and Congestion Management Study. And what that study looked at was the complete length of Highway 1, looked at what were obvious and potentially needed improvements along that, including intersection improvements and signalization in various locations along that highway. That was subject to subsequent revisions and modifications, but that was really sort of the stepping stone and the basis for the application that was made ultimately to SMCTA for the funding of this project. The 2013 circulation element was approved and adopted by the Planning Commission and City Council. Continued that basically the 2009 Highway 1 Traffic Safety and Congestion Management Study improvements and acknowledgements. And since about that 2012-13 point particularly, the CIP, the Capital Improvements Program, has reflected those improvements that have been identified, including the Highway 1 North and the Highway 1 South project. Tonight we're talking about South, but there is a separate project, which is the North project. So, next. Can you click it? Thanks. So one of the kind of the critical underlying issues to this project and many of the projects that we're going to be coming forward with in the coming months or even years is responding to the critical issue of how do we convey pedestrians and bicyclists east-west? How do we get folks from the east side of the highway over to the beaches, to Smithfield, for example, over to the coastal trail, and how do we convey both tourists and residents to those? How do we get kids over to the schools, back and forth across the schools safely? How do we deal with these issues? If you see here, one of the challenges we have is about a 1 mile strip there from Poplar down to the next signalized crossing point at Highway 1, which is at Fairway Drive, Ocean Colony access. So in that, you've got a whole segment of the Naomi Patridge Trail that runs along there, which provides access to Wavecrest and ultimately to Smithfield, and ultimately for a lot of people, continuation into the beach and the coastal trail area, as well as to the dog park and other improvements. I'm guessing not too many people probably carry their horseshoes over to the horseshoe pit, but it's possible. But we have, in between that point, no way to convey people east-west safely. There's no crossing, there's no signalized crossing. It is an extremely difficult proposition to move those folks around. Now, we also recognize that Poplar, the Poplar signalization improved things to some extent. It certainly provided a safer access way for the seniors getting over to the beach, for example, and for children living in the neighborhood there to get to Seacrest School, for example. There are certainly much needed improvements along with that, and frankly, one of the challenges, one of the issues that we're trying to look at and address within the context of this project is don't fall into the same trap of being cheap and not doing the right improvements at that intersection and making it safe and making it work for the community as a whole. We recently were able to leverage and twist the arm of Caltrans to do some additional improvements to Poplar, but and frankly, it's not where we would like it to be. I don't think it's where anybody would like it to be exactly, but it is where it is, and we don't want to duplicate that effort. And so part of that effort is to look at this in a much broader perspective and to make the improvements that are needed and to make this a safe access. Thanks. Next. So this does have a long history, a relatively long history, I guess, in the context of, again, 2012, SMCTA awarded us, we went to the City Council authorized staff to submit, we proceeded and received the funding. So there's been a lot of work, a lot of effort. 2013, there was a great deal of community information and outreach that was started there. Frankly, this has been a process of start and stop on both segments of this project, and to some extent, that's the nature of the challenge we have with our permitting agency. It's also part of the issue of, frankly, other objectives and other higher priority issues that kept coming in the way of some of these projects. But in 2013, there was community and outreach efforts. There was also, the permit engineering commenced with Caltrans District 4, including traffic data, which included bike and pedestrian counts. We had done original traffic data. It didn't include bike and pedestrian. Caltrans asked for the bike and pedestrian to be included with that. There was also, had by 2013, changes in the Caltrans requirements, which required a roundabout analysis to look at whether a roundabout made sense. And basically at Caltrans, for virtually any intersection improvements involving particularly signalization on any of the state highways, they require an assessment to be done and an analysis, and for Caltrans to review that and determine if they believe that the roundabout is the most appropriate means to address that. They ultimately, Caltrans landed on that for a number of reasons, the roundabout was not the appropriate use and action for that. What I would point out is one of the major pieces to the reason why the roundabout, in our mind, in our estimation, was not the right decision, was because one of the primary and principal benefits of the signalization project overall was to more safely convey pedestrian and bicycles. Roundabouts are great for addressing vehicular traffic. They are not so great for dealing with bicycle and pedestrian access, and particularly through this width and this amount of lanes that we're dealing with, and that's really, from our perspective, was not meeting that objective. We love roundabouts. We'd love to see and find a place for them in the community. This one we just did not feel, and Caltrans agreed and concurred with the consultant team that was not the issue. Next, thanks. So in 2015, the City Council convened and created a mobility committee. This was brought to them as part of that. This also went back to City Council to confirm and determine in 2015 that the City Council wanted to proceed and to continue to proceed with both the north and the south projects. So based on that response and the council's direction, we have proceeded forward with that. This now is really coming to the point of where we are today. We conducted a series of neighborhood meetings and community meetings in 2016. We also commenced work with environmental work, and in 2017, we're now at the point of finally obtaining the Caltrans peer project engineering report. And you are here, and we're here asking for your approval of both the coastal development permit as well as approval of the initial study and mitigated negative declaration. I'll note also that in 2017 in August, we conducted another community meeting primarily about Highway 1 North, but we also talked and touched on the Highway 1 South project. And in between all of those were several council meetings in which this item was discussed and direction provided to proceed with protecting this. I will again say what I've said, who's that, all along, which is that this is clearly a community issue and a community project. We think that there are substantial benefits to that, but one of the critical path issues that we're dealing with is that the money that we have allocated from SMCTA is threatened. If you go over on Highway 101 anywhere in San Mateo County, you'll find a lot of work being done over there and a lot of off-ramps and ramps, and you see on 92 the fun work at El Camino Real and all this. There's a lot of work, a lot of projects that are not fully funded. They are working on but not fully funded, and SMCTA is looking at every opportunity to figure out where they can find additional monies, and they're looking at projects that they consider not having been delivered as yet, and that includes us. So we responded just in October, provided them an update of where we are, and requested their consideration for continuing to fund both the north and the south projects, and laid out that we were coming to the Planning Commission for this action and that we had the peer action. So I'm just want to put that out there just so it's understanding of why this is important, why the action's important, and why what we'll say ultimately is if the Planning Commission would like to see and condition that certain things come back, such as the landscape plans for review and approval, we have no issue with that. The critical path issue for us is to have the initial study approved, the initial study in MND approved and the CDP approved. It can be approved with conditions, but we're here asking for that approval from that perspective. So as part of this, there was also some questions about, well, what other alternatives were looked at and analyzed. I will point to this as the 2013 iteration of this project, which did not include signalization at this point. It included the removal of the high-speed off ramp there onto Main Street, but it did not include signalization, and you'll note it did not include any crosswalks, any access for pedestrians, and no bicycle improvements as well. So we've evolved this around through looking at complete streets concepts. I'll also, for the record, state that we did a traffic analysis again subsequent and after this whole design had initially been conceptualized with that, which then showed that the intersection did warrant signalization. To be clear and for the record, that analysis and that report did not include any improvements, any development on the triangle piece that's there, that's the Jameson property. So it met warrants without any project, any idea, because there was nothing proposed at that point. And so the warrants for signalization were met without anything. So this is never, to be clear, this was never about the Jameson Hotel project or anything else. This was clearly about improvements to the intersection for pedestrian and bicycle, safety improvements to not have folks driving off the highway at 55 and hitting the fire station and fire trucks trying to pull out of there. And ultimately, it was also about improving the aesthetic and trying to look at slowing folks down and acknowledging and recognizing that they were hitting and reaching a point of really the city limits, even though they've hit them long before that. But clearly there's a segment there and folks are coming through and hitting Poplar at, we believe and we agree with the community, at too high of a speed. And we think, and we'd like to look at and talk to Caltrans about lowering that. And Jill will talk to the Town Boulevard concept issue a little bit of also part of that idea of slowing things down and dealing with that. But this was a first step in terms of addressing some of those issues. So, right.
Thank you, John. Good evening, Commissioners. My name is Ray Razavi. I'm with the Public Works Department. And
I think the microphones have a cold.
thank you. I'm going to cover a bit of project features and go over some plans and get you familiar with what we're proposing. These are the key features for the project. Starting with the most important one, signalizing the intersection at South Main and Highway 1, improving the intersection with Higgins Canyon Road as it goes by the fire station. One of the most important features is controlled crossings for bicycle and pedestrian. This is a very critical crossing, and it's almost impossible to cross and access the Naomi Patridge Trail. We also want to landscape the entry and the medians in this area, make it look like you're actually entering into a city that's a nice entry with plants and landscaping. And we're also looking at a future monument sign to let the people know that you're actually entering Half Moon Bay, and this is the start of the downtown areas. Most of the motorists don't realize that they're actually getting close to downtown Half Moon Bay, and South Main Street would take them to the shops and restaurants. What you see here is the proposed project. This is the plan that we prepared and submitted to Caltrans for approval. I know there's a lot of information on there. This is our standard plans that we prepare. This was prepared by consultant Mark Thomas and Company. And I'm going to zoom in into the area of interest, which is the intersection of South Main, and blow that up for you. This is Highway 1. North is to the right, south to the left, and this is South Main Street. What we're looking at is Naomi Patridge Trail. This is the multi-use trail on the west side of the highway. And this is the original high-speed turn that's going to be eliminated and replaced with landscaping and a pedestrian path coming to the intersection. We're going to have 3 safe crossing, controlled crossing. We will have 2 pedestrian refuge areas as part of the landscaping, both going north and south in the median, along with the southeast corner that's going to be landscaped and possible future signage for the entry to the city, the monument. This is a bit of a cross-section that we just put as a sample for one of the sections. Just believe this is right at the, you see the left side, the existing bike trail on the left. That's the west side. You got the standard shoulders and lane configurations with the landscape medians and shoulders. These are all per Caltrans requirements, so they all meet the standard. We have a bike lane that comes in between the through lane and the right lane coming into South Main Street, so the bicyclist could have a refuge area in order to get through after the signal turns green. Prepared some visual photographs to kind of show you what we're planning to do here. This is on South Main Street. You're looking south as you come down on South Main. You will see this intersection. This is the high-speed turn that we're going to eliminate. This whole area would be landscaped, so the turns would actually, the right turns would come to the intersection, to the signal, and then make a right turn. This is the Higgins Canyon Road. We have a lot of bicyclists that have complained that they're coming down and you got the high-speed turn. The cars just come in at very high speed going on to South Main Street, and there's a big conflict and an unsafe condition here. The fire station is also located on the left side. So as I was walking across, I came to the, to take this picture, came to the median. On the northbound, obviously people come really fast. They don't know they're approaching the city. And as you're crossing to the southbound, they went faster because they just passed Poplar Street signal, and they think they're out of the city, and they're just flying in, and it's very, very difficult to cross onto the Naomi Patridge Trail. So you go to the Naomi Patridge, this is the trail, and this is the proposed crossing, and we're hoping that this intersection would be totally improved, that you have people, pedestrians, bicyclists, etc., be able to access the trail at this location.
Good evening, Commission. My name is Grant Gruber. I'm a project manager with First Carbon Solutions. We are the city's consultant. We prepared the initial study, mitigated negative declaration for the project, which is California Environmental Quality Act document. And just some background about our involvement. We have been the city's consultant on many prior projects going back to 2006. And we were engaged on this project, I want to say circa 2010. And so we've seen how the project's evolved over time and have been we're involved with some of the rounds of prior review. So this document is 63 pages, and it covers some key topics such as aesthetics, air quality, biological resources, cultural and tribal resources, greenhouse gas emissions, hazards and hazardous materials, hydrology and water quality, noise, and transportation. And so as John mentioned in his presentation, we started this process back in July when we sat down with Caltrans, specifically Jill, Ray, myself. We met with District Forest staff over in Oakland, and basically we had to get them on the same page as us as to who should be the lead agency for the purposes of overseeing the California Environmental Quality Act documentation. That had been an issue in the past. Caltrans had been somewhat reluctant to delegate its authority So we sat down with them, and we ended up having a good, productive meeting, and they ultimately agreed to give the city, delegate authority to the city. Shortly thereafter, we began preparing this document. We released it for public review on October 18th, 2017. Documents like these have a 30-day statutory review period. So that circulated from October 18th through November 17th. And just to provide a little background, the reason we did this type of documentation is because we found all of the impacts were either less than significant or could be mitigated to a level of less than significant. So when those types of circumstances apply, the California Environmental Quality Act says you can do a mitigated neg deck or just a neg deck. And so long story short is the CEQA process is essentially concluded and no comments were received. And with that, I'll turn it back to Jill.
Thank you. So this focus is on the local coastal program conformance, the consistency with that, as well as the city's general plan. And as you already heard from John Dowdy about the 2013 circulation element, that element had three themes. It was safety, multimodal mobility, and connectivity. And it's full of policies that are representative of those themes. This project is consistent with those, and furthermore is a complete streets approach. The 2013 circulation element was the first policy document that the city had that put out complete streets in that format. So we found that that was consistent with the circulation element, even though this particular project was not yet identified through the 2009 Highway 1 safety study. With respect to the local coastal program, which is both the land use plan, the policy side, as well as the zoning, we really focused on one of the key items is that this project is not going to build capacity, and it is not going to increase the footprint of the roadway. Thus, it is not growth-inducing, and it is supportive of quite a few coastal policies, including supporting coastal access and recreation, and at the same time is protective of resources because it has not expanded its footprint. So in your staff report, Exhibit A to the resolution, we go into a higher level of detail on these findings, and we hope that they're helpful. They do relate to the CEQA assessment as well. Noting that it's a little bit different to apply the local coastal program to the roadway type of project. The local coastal program policies are really geared towards property development or land uses and not necessarily this kind of facility. So we try to make sure that we are being consistent in that way, as well as with public works. Next slide. Oh, thank you. So that said, those are the documents on the books that were the basis for those findings. We obviously have quite a few plans underway that are at different phases of development and review through the Planning Commission and other bodies of the city. And we just wanted to note how this proposal relates to those, because there's so much public input on those planning efforts and consistency with what we believe there's a lot of synergy around and consensus, in particular from the Planning Commission, we think is important. So with regards to the local coastal program update, we have identified both the Town Boulevard concept as well as the East Side Parallel Trail. This project is not going to implement the East Side Parallel Trail in this span. However, it does leave room for it. It is not consuming right-of-way, and that was something that as it was identified that we were going to have a Class 1 trail on the east side of Highway 1, that was something that was new in the design development for this intersection, as Grant can attest to from those older plans. And so we had to go back and make absolutely certain that this project wasn't going to preclude, or we weren't taking advantage of an opportunity to do some realignment if it was necessary at this time. So East Side Parallel Trail will be on its own. It will be its own project with its own analysis, and at a future time, assuming that that policy goes forward in the LCP. Also, the Town Boulevard concept, as John mentioned, for this project, timing is it's just in advance of our ability to study North Main Street to South Main Street for a detailed implementation of the Town Boulevard. In my opinion, and in staff's opinion, we think this project has many components that are consistent with what we heard from the Planning Commission about the Town Boulevard initiative, and specifically thinking about the landscaping, the medians, the slowing down of traffic, not increasing capacity, shortening the pedestrian crossings by having pedestrian refuge. There are a few other pedestrian features that are built into this as well, such as the pedestrian countdown signals and the timing of pedestrian crossings. That's something that has been changed over recent years. I think Caltrans now allows, it's like, you probably know it off the top of your head. I'm trying to remember what it is. It's about 25% longer green time for a walk per Caltrans standards than what it used to be, to ensure that folks can get all the way across the road. There's a few other things with respect to bicycles that aren't evident in the plans. There's signal detection for bicycles that will be included in the intersection. They can be done either through those signal loop detectors in the pavement, although I think what our traffic engineer is looking at is a different kind of a monitor that works better. Yes?
Detected cameras.
Okay, the camera technique. Okay. And that is something we got a lot of feedback about with the Bicycle and Pedestrian Advisory Committee for other parts of town. And that was something that was, none of those features were included in the original proposal, obviously, that didn't have a signalized intersection at all. But I can tell you there was a version of this plan in I think it was about 2015. It was sitting on a table behind where I was working away on your LCP, and I happened to walk by it, and it had a signal, and it had only one crosswalk. I walked back by it with a red pen, and there were more crosswalks at that point. So it's gotten a lot of layers of pedestrian and bicycle components based on the 2013 circulation element and the work we're doing on the LCP and general plan update. Insofar as the draft circulation element has been made to be consistent and walk along with the LCP, we see consistency there as well. The bicycle and pedestrian master plan recommendations are coming out on December 7th. We would say this is supportive. And in fact, the Parks Master Plan, which is coming your way in its first draft, will also really emphasize the need for the east-west connection and the ability to provide that coastal access between downtown and the beaches. And this is one way to finally get this at the south end of downtown. There are certainly ways to get from the Naomi Patridge Trail to some of our coastal access routes and then connect to the coastal trail. So we know that you have a really active planning environment, and it's frustrating to hang our hat on really old policies. And so we want you to know that this is in our opinion, appropriate for both the old documents and the new. We see it as a great improvement. With respect to the actual look of the signal features of the mast arms and those kinds of things, we are not proposing anything special at this point. We'd be interested in your feedback. My perspective is what is there is almost invisible because we're used to seeing it, and from Half Moon Bay to Santa Cruz, it is a really consistent format. Other folks may be really interested in having us look at some other kinds of treatments. You can give us that feedback and we'll see what the choices are, remembering that this is not our right of way. So we have perhaps some limitations. Next. So for John or Ray to...
Yes, so what we're planning to do is, the three conditions that's required in order for us to secure the funding and enter into an agreement with the Transportation Authority. One is the approval of PIER by Caltrans, which is in the process. We're expecting the final signature any day now. The second is the approval of the environmental document that Caltrans has designated us as the lead. And the third is this coastal development permit. Once we have these three things in place, then we can secure the funding, have an agreement with TA, and that funding will not go away. And that's for $3.5 million. Includes $300,000 for design and $3.2 million for construction. We will prepare the final design plans and specifications in coordination with input from the city, and we will submit that to Caltrans for approval. We get the final approval from Caltrans, advertise for construction, and hopefully start construction either in fall of 2018 or spring of 2019. Construction would last approximately 3 to 4 months roughly.
Turning it back to the chair, this is our typical format for clarifying questions, holding a public hearing, and your deliberations. We have the recommendation prepared on the slide for the public to see, as well as in your packet. And obviously, there's quite a few folks here to field questions. Thank you.
Very good. I just wanted to ask a quick clarifying question. When you talk about the review process, which you just concluded with, Caltrans isn't going to go away and come back with the design. The city, you specifically as the city's engineer, are going to work with Caltrans to come up with the final design. Is that correct?
Well, we will propose the final design. We have a consulting firm of Mark Thomas, and they've done many freeways, and they're expert in the Bay Area. We will have them on the contract. They prepared the preliminary plans. So what we have to do is turn these preliminary plans to the final plans, so which would be 35%, 65%, 95%, and then get Caltrans concurrence after we have the city's concurrence to get to 100%. And once we have the 100%, then we can go ahead and advertise for bids, and we get Caltrans buy-off.
And what is the city's process for review? This doesn't come back to the Planning Commission. This would go to City Council. Like, can you walk me through that? Or is it just city staff makes the final review?
There would definitely be opportunities for input because we looking at a lot of design features here, and a lot of these design features is what we want to propose before we actually turn it into Caltrans for a permit. So we will be coordinating with definitely the City Council, but I'm assuming that through Jill, through planning, we will coordinate exactly what kind of details we want to see in terms of the look and the feel of that corridor and how we want to perceive it. That will go into the design at the first stage.
So let me, so first and foremost, there is some limitations in what design changes will occur simply because of Caltrans standards and requirements that are entrenched and not available. However, I prefaced my original comments a bit, and the question I think is appropriate. We're asking you ultimately to tell us if you would like to see these, the more details, at what point you would like to see, and what would you like to see. For example, you may apply conditions to the CDP that say, staff bring back the landscape plans to the Planning Commission for review and blessing. There's no obligation to do that, but if a majority of you would like to see those and think that's appropriate and think that the community input would be valuable at that point to deal with that, we're happy to bring those back. You know, so there are things such as that. Clearly, there are things included in this. We've talked about the entry signage. The entry signage will be a separate issue, separate permit, separate encroachment permit issues with the Caltrans likely, and the design, although the Planning Commission, City Council have approved conceptual designs already. I have a belief that Planning Commission and City Council may want to revisit those and look at that, whether those still make sense almost 5 years later at that point, moving forward. Those are things that certainly we see will likely come back to you. So there are points in this that that clearly there can be check-ins, but there is an engineering component to this, which is just going to typically be an exchange between our engineering firm and going back and forth through the process of the engineers at Caltrans for the typical engineering related issues. But things such as the landscaping, things such as perhaps the mastheads, you know, could be something that you could come back and revisit as an architectural review or design review component.
Yeah, my questions were really not directed towards the dressing around the project. It's really more around the pedestrian safety and the bicyclist safety, and who it's the decision is made between the city's engineering department and Caltrans is what I'm hearing.
Yes.
And I'm not really interested in the dressing as much as the core project itself. That's not coming back to City Council. It's not coming back to Planning Commission. You guys are entrusted with making a decision.
Now, I will say this, there is a role that has yet to be fully defined as where the Bike Pedestrian Advisory Committee falls, and I do believe that they may and will probably have a role in looking at this probably at least one time before it is ultimately finalized. We think that group has a legitimate role in looking at that, and their call is to actually assist us in identifying and working through capital projects for bike and pedestrian improvements in particular. So I think there's a role there, and that may be one that we haven't really fully vetted, but I believe there's a role for them to look at that and deal with that prior to finalizing any of the absolute plans for that.
Very good. Questions?
So, Jill, you touched on this a little bit, but you just mentioned the Highway 1 crossings. I see 2 crossings of Highway 1. Wondering if that was a conscious decision versus just one crossing over Highway 1.
So in the practice, in the best practices for pedestrian and ADA access, we try to accomplish every single crossing that we can, and that's why you're seeing 2 instead of 1. And I understand, you know, there's some argument about the land uses that they're serving. We're pretty comfortable with the 2 because of how we think Higgins Canyon Road is going to work for bikes as well. So it's serving both of those modes.
Okay, so sort of building off of that, you know, I know a lot of cyclists kind of park along Main Street, unload their bikes there and cross over Main Street there. Is there thoughts on a Main Street crossing?
Ray and I were talking about that today. It's not in this project scope, but that is something that we're looking at a number of new crosswalks on Main Street, and that's an area that we can explore.
And so the stretch of Higgins Canyon Road between this project area and the Johnston House, is that outside of the Half Moon Bay city limits or outside of our purview?
It is. That's right.
Okay, so those are my questions at this point.
Okay.
Thank you. And I apologize to the public and the staff and especially the vice chair, for my coughing. I do not have the bubonic plague. It's just I inhaled some sawdust, so that's what I get.
Excuses.
Several questions. First, with respect to the staging area, I appreciate the comments that John provided. As I understand it, the project is basically silent on staging areas right now. Is that correct? So that was a yes. So if a staging area were to come forward, I would, with this staff, I certainly wouldn't expect it to appear on an ISHA. And yet stranger things have happened in Half Moon Bay in the past. So I'd be looking for that would be a form of development that's not covered by this CDP. And I would expect it to either be exempted or go through some process of its own. Is that a reasonable understanding based on where this sits?
I think that's fair. Another approach would be to add a condition about the staging area, and yeah. So
If we knew where it
that's
was,
okay.
that would, or if we had some candidate sites, that would be easier if it's
Fair
new.
enough.
Yeah. Okay,
Okay.
but thank you for that answer. Then with respect to the Half Moon Bay bugaboo of traffic on Highway 1, trying to make a turn off of Highway 1, being blinded as they make a turn by headlights in the opposing direction, and thereby potentially not seeing pedestrians or cyclists. In a situation like Kehoe or Roosevelt, where there are just two streets involved, the challenge is clear. In this situation, I count Main Street, Higgins Canyon Road, and Highway 1. And it looks like the extension has done a lot to reduce some of the risk of people turning off of Highway 1, because the median is so large that traffic is, if you're, for example, going south on Highway 1 and you're making a left turn, let's say, onto Main Street, I want to be sure that the lights of cars coming up Higgins Canyon or opposing direction on Main Street aren't going to threaten. Yeah. And I bring it up as an illustration of a broader question. So I guess the question I'm trying to ask that I hope Ray can address is, how are we managing the risk of nighttime accidents resulting from blinded drivers entering crosswalks that are occupied by pedestrians or cyclists? Is that fair?
That is a fair question. As part of the final design, we will consider all different angles of how the nighttime would affect these turning movements. So once we address those in the final design, then I guess would be a better time for us to make sure that this is a safe intersection to operate.
Yeah, I know everybody wants that, but I just, we've made mistakes like that in the past, so I'm hoping we can, not you, we, in fact, a subcommittee that I was a part of made that mistake. So I hope that we'll have a chance to weigh in.
Just so I understand, your question is mostly about the interaction of the headlight with the opposing traffic.
Yeah,
And with the crossings, with the pedestrian or bicyclist crossing on the crosswalk.
I'm concerned about a motorist being blinded by headlights as they're making a turn, and thereby losing the night vision they need to see a pedestrian or a cyclist that they could strike, because he or she does not know that the pedestrian or the cyclist is in the crosswalk. And I'm anticipating not just these 3 crosswalks that are shown, but also if there's a crosswalk envisioned on Higgins Canyon or on Main Street, that we're anticipating the sighting of these things in a way that we're looking out for the safety of our cyclists and pedestrians and the sanity of our motorists, none of whom want to have that accident.
I just want to, before you switch gears, when it comes to sighting in this part of town, what you're creating here is a bike path, right? And so in the mornings, you're going to have kids biking to Cunha, to Seacrest, crossing Highway 1 at this point, because would be a natural access point for both of those schools. In the morning, you have issues with the sunlight coming in and blinding drivers.
East side, yes.
Yeah, and it's actually, I've seen multiple near accidents and near misses from drivers not being able to see pedestrians on Main Street, on Highway 1, turning going from a north to south direction, turning to the east. So that way, heading down, you're gonna have potential visual problems. So just something to think about when you're doing the inspection is visually what happens in the mornings.
You took the words right out of my mouth, Chair, and I don't know if that's a potential issue for low afternoon suns for part of the year for traffic that's headed west or not, but the sunlight issue is another.
That's the usual problems we have with crosswalks, the low sun.
Yeah, I'd like
during
to
the
shift
winter
gear,
time.
now to the lead versus responsible agency, and just want to be on record saying what a civilized process it was, and congratulate Caltrans and the city for working out that lead agency, responsible agency relationship. That has not always worked smoothly in Half Moon Bay, and so that was really nice. Then one of the other agencies that's clearly impacted by this or potentially impacted by this project, who I see is represented here tonight, is the fire district. Since their access, of course, is important, I'd like to think that we're enhancing their ability to get in and get out quickly. But are they also a responsible agency on the CEQA document, and do you expect a similar relationship with them?
A responsible agency under CEQA is one that has to carry out a discretionary approval in order to implement the projects. So if they have no discretionary approvals they need to take action on, then they would not be a responsible agency.
Okay, no, that's perfect. Then to return to the question of scheduling, because you mentioned the morning time of day, do you anticipate that there's certain phases of the project, well, there clearly will be, that are going to block access to one or more lanes while they're doing the work? I assume that it's in the details somewhere that we're going to be doing that to minimize the impact on weekends and during our commute hours, which is basically all day. So we're doing this at 2 o'clock in the morning, is that right?
We're going to have staging for this project. Once we figure out the exact design, we get to 65%, before 95%, we come up with some staging plan. And we will keep traffic open, at least one lane in each direction. And the traffic would be shifted to the east and to the west at times in order to free up area for construction. And of course, we will coordinate. I mean, this will be something that we will actively manage, so we will be able to coordinate with the special events in the city.
I understand. And then the last, I was interested when I read the report to see the references to the habitat on the west side of Highway 1. Of course, we know that's frog and snake habitat. And we typically think of Highway 1 and Highway 92 as kind of barriers for that. I assume the reason that we're not saying, hey, if a frog gets up into the right-of-way, it's already toast, so the reason we have fencing along that edge is because we expect some of the work to be taking place at the edge of the right-of-way rather than or in the unpaved area, as opposed to actually in the paved area that's in the right-of-way. That is an area that is currently accessible to the frogs and snakes without peril. Is that right? Let me turn my mic off. That'll give you a shot.
It's the state, first off, it's Caltrans, it's the state right-of-way is the official term for it. Caltrans obviously maintains that area at the edge. It may not be paved, but it is mowed, disked. They manage it. They obviously don't want tall vegetation right up to the roadway. To the extent a frog or a snake could come into that area, that's always possible. So the appropriate way to prevent that is to erect fencing at the edge of the disturbance area. So that area is not considered habitat in the sense that it's natural. It's obviously managed by man, or in this case, the state of California. So you wouldn't treat it like a wetland, or you wouldn't try to protect it because it's not protected habitat. So the fencing is intended to essentially create an exclusion zone around that. And then in terms of the hypothetical scenario of a frog or a snake entering, I mean, that's obviously a natural phenomenon, and mortality is understood that that can happen from time to time, and it's just how things are.
So Caltrans, so Caltrans wouldn't accept, or the city wouldn't accept a condition like the ones we have on other coastal development permits that say, if we find these critters in our construction zone, we don't just keep going. If they get hit tough cookies, we wouldn't stop and remove them or allow them to leave of their own regard.
You have the discretion to add that, certainly. From our perspective, when we do CEQA documents, we're talking about kind of reasonably foreseeable scenarios in the future. We don't try to necessarily go through what is every conceivable option could a frog.
Yeah.
So,
Maybe another alternative that would be even easier would be exclusion fencing, so they wouldn't get into the work area to begin with.
well, we do have a mitigation measure in here that does say direct silt fencing, which is essentially the same thing.
Actually, with respect, I think there is a powerful distinction between exclusion fencing and silt fencing, but I understand your point. No further questions. Thank you.
Okay.
For the record, if there are endangered species anywhere in that construction zone or anything like that, there will be clearly direction to the contractor of what they do and what they don't do, which is they don't proceed on and continue on, just like any other location and any other CDP. The endangered species are an endangered species, and there is not going to be a take, at least knowingly or intentionally or anything that could have been avoided.
Thank you. Thanks.
I don't know if this can be answered now or if this is technically a clarifying question, but there's a development proposal, across the way from here, the Hyatt Place Hotel proposal. To what extent has traffic projections from that proposal been factored into this, or have they, or what potential is there for this project getting ahead of that project, or anything like that?
Well, I guess I'll go back to my original comments from the beginning. When this project was conceived of, there was no project conceived of on what I'll call the Jameson property. From that perspective, the warrants and everything were met without any project design or component to that. Now, with regard to the project, Jill can give you more of an update to that point. But frankly, what I know is that based on what allowable uses could be on that site, frankly, the proposal that's out there is one of the least traffic impacting uses of the various uses that could theoretically be in there from a commercial perspective. But those will all be looked at through the separate EIR process, which is currently in process. So we've looked at completely separating these because there's a discretionary action required. This is planned unit development. There's an EIR. There are potentially habitat designated wetlands, delineated wetlands there at that location. There are a lot of issues, a lot of hurdles, and a lot of challenges to go with that project. And so they really have to be separated and allow the community to process through and evaluate the other project separately.
So aside from that specific proposal, the property has a certain zoning designation, a certain general plan designation, a certain conditionally allowed use or something along those lines. So those traffic numbers, those traffic generation rates have been incorporated into this design and considered. Is that correct?
The answer is yes. The DKS did the traffic numbers, and they used basically the existing known land use scenarios out there and everything with that into their model, and they run the model, and that model's been available and used for various projects and many projects. So they've been updating, and they update that project in their modeling as it goes along. Fair enough.
Les?
Couple of clarifying questions. So there's on the west side between Highway 1, there's the Naomi Patridge Trail. I'm not sure what the distance is from the west side Highway 1 roadway to the trail. Is there anything there that's going to change?
The proposed control the crossings, we're going to have one crossing on the south side and one crossing on the north side, and those crossing will be connecting to the Naomi Patridge Trail.
Okay, so as far as the ditch or whatever there right now, there's no change proposed?
No change is proposed at the moment. However, once we get into the final design, we can put some improvements in to make it more palatable to both pedestrians and bicyclists. And as part of the landscaping plan, if you look at the plan here, most of our landscaping is in the median area and in this corner. So at the moment, we don't have any additional landscaping plan on the west side. So, but once we look at this intersection, extending this path, both on the north side and south side, the crossings to the multi-use trail, we can look at how this connection takes place and make it
secondly,
more agreeable.
I presume everything's going to be ADA compliant.
Absolutely ADA
okay.
compliant, yes.
I was involved in both the 2009, 2013 study, and at that time there didn't seem to be enough traffic as brought out to warrant a stoplight or a signal light. Yeah, we have more traffic, but as far as the number of residences to the south of that point, that really hasn't changed very much. So my next question is, are we doing a signalization that's passive or active, so that you know, as far as impeding traffic flow, if there's no bicyclist, pedestrian, or people turning? I'm trying to see how that's going to impact.
Well, we have made some changes to the flow of traffic. For example, the synchronization of the signals. This signal is one of the obviously, you know, Poplar, Kelly, and Highway 92 and Main, as well as 92 and Main. These are all has been coordinated. So we want to make sure that we don't impede the flow of traffic. Obviously, one of the main interests in here to make sure that the crossings are safe. So adding a signal will impact the flow of traffic. The question is, you know, is the safety worth the extra few seconds that you're going to have the traffic come to a stop and continue on Highway 1? And how long would it take for them to actually get to where they're going on north of Highway 1 or on 92? So this was done based on the background of the project. DKS is our traffic consultant, and they ran the number based on all the projects that have been approved. So, and once we have that, once we do the final design, we will look at the actual cycles that we require this to be effective. So at that time, we could take a look at that and see how does the whole corridor would operate based on what DKS is proposing now. So they have looked at the whole corridor and looked at the operation and looked at the numbers in the background. So I guess I need a little clarification from you as to what your concerns are specifically. Is it for the timing that gets across for the cars to go from south of the town to the north of the town, and how this would actually impact the whole corridor? Is that your concern? The delay for the vehicles or for the new development coming into this intersection?
Okay, I mean, my point is it doesn't have the same activity as Kelly and Highway 1. So again, from the point of traffic, there doesn't seem to be need, it wasn't at least 2009, 2013, for the same kind of delays involved in traffic. So I just want to make sure that that is incorporated into the plan.
Yes, that's how DKS ran the models, and that's how we submitted to Caltrans to convince them that this is necessary.
And I presume there'll be automated buttons for pedestrians.
Absolutely. We will have, we will try to incorporate the latest traffic instruments in this intersection. We would have, for example, automatic camera detectors. So, because one of the issues we have are bicyclists that come on the traffic lanes and are not detected with the loops that are in the ground. So we would propose the camera detectors that will actually detect bicyclists and would turn green for them. We would also allow enough timing for the bicyclist to get across this intersection rather than a car which goes faster, the bicyclist goes slower. Also for the pedestrians, we would have the countdown as well as advanced green for them so they'd be able to actually clear the intersection, at least the critical portion, before the cars get the green. So whatever the latest technology is, we'll try to incorporate and make this a safe intersection.
Okay, my final question is that has lighting been incorporated into this study? Because wherever you have people crossing, particularly at night, you want to ensure that it can be seen. I mean, there's fairly good lighting at Kelly. There's fairly good lighting at Maine and 92. So wondering whether any lighting studies were done for this signalization for this new intersection.
Yes, lighting is going to be a critical element for this, especially since you have these crossings and high-speed vehicles. So at night, it's very critical for us to evaluate the lighting and make sure we have adequate illumination with the correct candles. Yes.
John?
So my questions have been covered for now.
So, looking at this project and listening to Jimmy's comments about the multiple streets intersecting here, I'm reminded of another intersection in town that's not too dissimilar from this, which is the intersection off of Main Street and Parissima and Filbert, where you have a nearly identical type of situation where you've got some signalization, in this case stop signs, some streets that don't have stop signs, and there have been many bike accidents with cars, pedestrian accidents in that intersection over the years, and we're designing an intersection that's very similar to that area, which, you know, when we did some of the neighborhood listening sessions, that was an intersection that came up as having some challenges. So when I look at this design, and specifically when I look at our obligation to determine there's no substantial change or impact, I'm thinking about, is there a substantial impact to safety in this intersection? So I'm just trying to think through, you know, where do the pedestrians go when they're on the north side of the intersection? There's no sidewalk planned. We also have the 2001 San Mateo County Master Trails Plan. Mm-hmm. There's actually a plan for a trail to go all the way up to Parissima Creek that would intersect here. There's no the Caltrans just kind of dead ends because they don't have jurisdiction over Higgins. I guess they don't have jurisdiction over Higgins Canyon Road, and it's the county's problem. But that creates a problem for pedestrians because they're left stranded, right? And a similar thing happens on Poplar Street and Highway 1 today, where there's no real plan to get the pedestrians out of there. And so to me, the only sidewalk that exists today is on the east side of Main Street, and there's no actual connection, there's no crosswalk. And you know, that's something where we need to kind of think through how we're going to get pedestrians and bicyclists safely through. I am worried about the longer-term hotel project that's coming in. Where are we going to put the sidewalks? How are they going to fit into this? Because there are no sidewalks once you get past the theater. They sort of dead end there on that project. So just thinking through what is the circulation element, because under the what is the circulation going to look like when we're all done? I know that the warrants for this project predate the proposed hotel project that's coming here, but I'm curious as to what your thoughts are around this and how you plan to address it, because I'm seeing some definite improvements, but I'm also concerned that the net effect is the road's going to be wider, it's going to take longer to get across. Are we actually making this safer for pedestrians or not, especially given the high speed that people take coming from Highway 1 getting to this intersection? And people at hotels enjoy beverages, they're going to walk to the beach, you're going to have issues at night. These are the concerns that I have as from a planning perspective, is making sure that there is no material impact to the safety of the people who are foreseeably going to be using this area.
Those are understandable concerns. I mean, this is going to be one of the few links from east to west. So our challenge would be how to make this intersection safe. And one of the questions was about nighttime, and definitely at nighttime, illumination is going to be a big factor, and we're going to pay special attention to that. The other point that was raised is most of this is pretty much in the Caltrans right-of-way. And we have some city right-of-way, we got some county right-of-way, but looking at this whole intersection and going down on Main Street, there's an opportunity for us to look at what kind of improvements we can do in conjunction with any proposed development that comes in. So there has been a coordination. I have been in meetings and looked at the plans on the development of the site just to the north. But one of the advantages we have with this project is we have a healthy funds available. The budget is pretty healthy for this. And we are lucky in that sense. We're not as lucky in the Highway 1 North, but Highway 1 South, we do have adequate funding to make sure that we spend the funding necessary to make this a really successful project. But it means that we have to say that we're going to pay attention to these very fine details. And some of the improvements may go outside of the Caltrans right away, and so we have to pay attention to those. So as you said, on the west side, we're going to connect to Naomi Patridge Trail, and we're going to look at how we're going to do this connection. We're going to make this safe in terms of the radiuses, make sure if you're on a bicycle, you have the correct radius to be able to turn north or south. On the south side is a little more complex. With the fire station here, with the high-speed bicyclists coming down on the Canyon Road, and like you said, pedestrians coming out of the hotel, and they may be going to downtown and coming back, and they want to make sure that with the high-speed cars coming in from northbound, we still would be able to provide them a good illuminated intersection with correct crosswalks, sidewalks, etc. So one of the important issues is how we're actually going to incorporate this into the final design, and we're going to pay attention to it since we would have the adequate funding to do that.
Are you considering concrete islands for pedestrians, raised footing, graded bike paths? I mean, you're talking about putting in a potential bike path in some of the drawings. I'm concerned that unless the bicyclists are separated through some kind of physical barrier on Highway 1, it's just going to become a game of Frogger with the bicyclists, and it's not actually going to be a complete street. So what is the thinking in terms of making this safe for bicyclists?
Yeah, I mean, we have to kind of think out of the box in this intersection. We want to make sure, I mean, the intersection, it should be designed for several type of bicyclists. As you know, in Half Moon Bay, we have some hardcore bicyclists that only want to ride on Highway 1. Even if you have a path parallel to it, they won't go on the path. They like to be a Class 3 right next to the vehicle. So we have to accommodate them either going southbound or northbound. We also have bicyclists like myself that I like to be separated. I don't want to ride with the cars. And I'm assuming, you know, if you're a parent, that's what you want for your kids. They want to separate them. So we want to make sure as they come down Main Street, they'll be easily connected to the Naomi Patridge Trail in a safe manner. So we're going to look at both of them, and we're going to make sure we accommodate both type of bicyclists, because we do have about a 50-50 based on the information that I observed on Highway 1 in this corridor. We have both types equally.
I know we've already addressed the traffic circles. You guys considered that earlier, but there's some interesting phenomena with Highway 1 here, in that it goes from 2 lanes to 1 lane and back again on both sides of the road. And I understand for access to Camerons, you probably don't want to mess with that because that's probably well thought out. But any thought about just, instead of reducing this to 1 lane, 300 yards down the street when you're heading north, why don't you just do that here as opposed to doing it further down the street?
That's actually my first question, my discussion with the traffic engineers and the transportation engineer, Mark Thomas. And they said it would affect the level of service. It actually would reduce the level of service, and Caltrans will not buy off on it. So that was basically the end of the story on that one.
Okay, I asked the question. Are we going to underground the utilities when we do this? Because there's utility lines going across Highway 1. Is that part of the project right now, or is that not something you guys would?
The only utilities that would be that would require for this project would be for the signal and for the lights, and those would be underground. But the rest of the utilities, we don't have a project included as part of this to go any further than that. However, based on my conversation, that there were some undergrounding proposed as part of the Northam property, the hotel project. So we will coordinate with them as part of the development of the plans.
Great. I don't have any further questions. Okay. This is, I'm going to open it up for public comments. I don't have any public comment cards. For those of you who'd like to speak, I invite you to come up to the lectern. You can submit a comment card later. I don't see anybody. Yes, I have a couple of folks. Could you please?
I kind of apologize for not being totally prepared, but when I was looking through the packet, I noticed, and this would really be a question for the environmental
Hey,
study.
Jerry, could you speak a little closer to the microphone, please?
I noticed that there's been discovered some wetlands within a 100-foot buffer of the project, but I'm assuming that because the project is not widening the road or increasing it, that it's okay. I mean, it seemed to be emphasized in the packet. I mean, it was in bold letters.
Do you have any other comments or questions?
No, that was the only
Okay,
question.
I'll direct that back to city staff. Thanks, Jerry.
So those were only recently identified when a biological resource evaluation was conducted on the property adjacent. We're trying to not talk about that one too much because it's not on the agenda. That said, the resource evaluation is in circulation right now, and so the timing for that, we don't have the final conclusion with it. The input and the feedback we've had from Coastal Commission staff is that these are really thin strips of wetlands, and they were probably created by the drainage pattern off of the highway, and they're not necessarily very high quality. They're a really common phenomena in this area, and the project itself will really only during its construction phase function differently than when it's operational. And so the intent is to have no runoff, no impact on any site, because site control is required regardless of the conditions. So we believe that the containment of this project site and fencing, and we're going to hear more about that, I assume, will be more than adequate to address any concerns that may come to be. There will be no project activity on that property.
We have one more public comment. Thank you.
Good evening. My name is Mark Mondragon. I am currently the Fire Marshal for Coastside Fire District in the County of San Mateo. This proposal for the stoplight has been reviewed by myself, my Deputy Fire Marshal, and the Fire Chief for Coastside. And we find that the project will actually make the area safer. The high-speed turnout right now coming north, we've had plenty of accidents right there at the fire station. This will actually cut down on those, we feel. The right-hand turn with the lavender, that is actually a little path that comes down to, and there is a stop sign right there at Higgins. So I think that this whole design would actually improve that. I also been on the many meetings with Connect Coastside and looking at the traffic from very south of there all the way through Devil Slide and up 92, and this kind of fits into what they're looking at and they've been looking at. The only thing the fire department would suggest or require is that the stoplight itself, when they design and the specifications of the stop lights, have the Opticon, which most of the lights have now. And the Opticon is basically, as we come out of the fire station, we have a little device on the engine that just says, hey, we're coming out code 3, turn the lights red to stop the traffic so we can actually cross the stoplights. And that's already in most of the stoplights. So that's the only thing that we would like to see as a requirement in the design of the stoplight itself. But as far as the intersection, we have no problems with the intersection and agree with the project as proposed. Thank you. Any questions for the fire? I'd be more than happy to answer.
Thank you, and as a first responder and representative of CAL FIRE, thank you for your comments, especially I'm sure you've been witness to many accidents at that location, so definitely appreciate that feedback. Any other questions? Or are there any other public comments? Okay, I'm going to close public comment, and I'm going to direct it back to city staff, or back to the Planning Commission for discussion.
Through the chair.
Please.
So I got to tell you, I really like this project. It's been a long time coming. I think staff's been very responsive to the concerns that have been raised. It's gone through a crucible of design over a period of time. And I think despite the fact that it's had to respond to a lot of problems that we might see now, staff has still found a way to skate toward where the hockey puck is going to be rather than to where it is now. I think that I heard a list of 5 or 6 concerns that I think if they were added to this, the resolution that's next in order, I could certainly support. Those would involve the review of alignment for the bicycle and ped routes by the pedestrian and bicycle committee or the planning commission, depending on and/or coastal development permit process for the staging area, the staging of improvements to minimize the impacts on commuter traffic during construction, consistency with pedestrian and bike transit improvements that are between the intersection and nearby destinations, trying to address the question that Les had asked, exclusion fencing, and reports, of course, as John suggested, the protocol, if you did find a listed species, you'd report it through the California Natural Diversity Database and do appropriate monitoring, so those kinds of modifications. Other than that, I feel very, very good about the resolution as presented. Thank you.
Brian?
I would echo some of Jimmy's comments. I like the project. Some of my comments are going to be sort of on the periphery of the project, and sort of related to just some of the things I would like to see that sort of relate to this. So getting back to the sort of the connection along Higgins Canyon Road between this project site and the Johnston House. I know it's not part of this project, but I'm going to take the opportunity to just sort of advocate for some level of bike and pedestrian improvements along that stretch. As I mentioned, I know a lot of people, a lot of cyclists currently use Main Street and that shoulder of Main Street as kind of their de facto staging area, their launching point for their bike trips. Frankly, I think Johnston House and the parking lot there is probably a more appropriate site for that, from a launching point for them to go riding up Higgins Canyon Road. So if there's signage or any sort of improvements that can sort of direct those sorts of folks to launch their bike trips off of out of the Johnston House parking lot and going up Higgins Canyon Road, would sort of ameliorate the conditions along Higgins Canyon Road there. But if there were at some point in the future San Mateo County looking at bike and ped improvements in this sort of area, doing something along that stretch. My concern is, and I know staff shares this concern, but not replicating the sort of the Poplar intersection effect, where we basically make a number of improvements for pedestrian and cycling improvements that essentially drop people off onto an unimproved pedestrian path to nowhere, exactly, and potentially a dangerous situation, and possibly a liability for the city as well. So I hope we can avoid that. But that's one of my big concerns here. In terms of, I have some thoughts, and John mentioned this regarding the monument signage there. I would like to see any signage or any improvements or any monument improvements that are incorporated as this, not just as part of this project, but as part of a broader downtown sign improvement program. So not just a one-off just for this one site. We don't need another potato chip or pot sticker or something there. So beyond that, I think getting back to the crossing of Main Street, I think it's something to consider. At this stage, it's probably, people dash across there, and, maybe not the biggest issue in the world, but there is a lot of crossing just on that stretch of Main Street from folks who are sort of parking and running across over to the fire station side or biking across there. So something to consider there. But all in all, I think I support this project as it's presented, and look forward to the sort of other improvements around this area that can tie it in to the broader network.
Thank you, Brian. John?
So I'm agreeing with everyone else that I generally think this is a welcomed project to signalize this intersection, especially for the fire department. And a couple of points on the night lighting. I can't say enough good things about the Bay Bridge. And anytime, if you just have a chance to drive over the Bay Bridge at night, the new portion of the Bay Bridge, the lighting there is brilliant. I mean, whoever that, and I should have looked up who the lighting designer was, because there is absolutely no glare, no matter where you're going, and you can see perfectly everywhere. I mean, it's just completely brilliant, and the fixtures themselves kind of fit in, and so hopefully we have a mechanism to do that at this intersection. I don't expect one kind of lighting is more expensive than another, generally speaking, and so compared to typically what we see for night lighting, it would be just a great opportunity. been looking at this for quite a while, and for years and years been driving through this, and I'm somehow struggling a little bit with, when I look at the aerial view of this is just the Google map picture, there's really sort of nothing here. You know, it's sort of the south entrance to the town, even though the gateway is really the mountains we look at and the farmland and all of that. So I keep struggling with, well, how would anything be better than what that already is? And so I look at the intersection itself as a composition. So the signaling, the size of the intersection, any potential signage that we do, all of it, any landscaping, should be looked at, I think, as a whole unit. Not this, okay, we bring back the landscaping for approval independently of what's the lighting fixtures look like for approval, because it is the whole intersection. And like everybody else, I struggle with this, and I'm pointing to the Google map where you're kind of driving north and you kind of zoom onto Main Street, you know, and if I'm driving a car that handles well, I kind of zip around there, and if I don't, I'm kind of a maniac trying to go 40 miles an hour driving through there. And I struggle with that, except that as I come north on Highway 1, I'm able to look up Main Street. And the reason I am is because that's the highway that's been there for 150 years. You know, so it's there, and I kept struggling, and then I, you know, somehow when you look at everything over and over again, it always looks the same. And so just the other day, this sort of really dumb question popped into my mind, and there must be some reason for that this hasn't happened, but I'm just kind of curious why there isn't a stop sign where that off. You know, the turn comes to Higgins and Main Street. You know, I kind of drove there and I thought, well, you know, if I had to stop here, that would really change the impact of how that traffic flow goes through there. So when I kept thinking about that, I thought, well, if there were a stop sign there, and I don't know why there isn't, and we just kept that road the way, so it's just really not a significant change to any of this. We just, rather than eliminate that road and try to re-landscape the pavement that's already there, if we just kept it the way it was with a stop sign, then we could still signalize that intersection, have all the bike paths and the pedestrian paths go through there, and not have to build a right turn lane at the signalized intersection. And for me, the disappointment with that little right turn at the signal is that I don't think anyone's going to make that unless they're intentionally going somewhere in town. So they already know that they need to make a turn there to get to school or something. So here's the sketch of what it might be like, and I'll just kind of hand this around. And I didn't make a million copies of it, and I would have gladly shown it to the staff before today, had I had it to do that. So here, I made one little, I'll just kind of hand it down, and I'll give a small copy to me. So not trying to clog the works, and I think you actually are maybe potentially still in the schematic design phase of this. You want to give this, have no desire to slow things down or change things, and maybe it's even cheaper to do this. I don't know. So I wish this had occurred to me sooner. I don't know why it didn't, but so I think we're also will continually face how do we get at-grade crossings across Highway 1 with bicycles and people. Right now we don't have solutions for that, so a signal is a great solution to that right now, and we can always take the signal away if sometime in the future there's better solutions to that. So there you go. So I guess it's a question is, I'm giving this as suggestive input and not trying to change your design at all. That I think it's a potential tweak that's worth considering.
Well, a couple
maybe
things.
reasons why you can't. You know,
we are past that point with the Caltrans review and approval. one of the reasons that this will create an extra level for pedestrian and bicyclists, right now, pedestrian bicyclists would have this main control crossing. So if you keep another right turn here, that would be another crossing.
Well, if you look at the sketch, I figured that in there.
Yeah.
I mean, if you just have a stop sign and a crosswalk, it can all circulate across there. I mean, I'm just baffled that we don't have a stop sign there now.
Yeah, through
No, I
the,
mean, right now, I mean, I don't understand why we don't have a stop sign
from
where
the
Highway
planning,
1 comes into Main Street.
through the chair, can I respond a little bit from the
Sure.
planning perspective
Please,
also?
Jill.
Okay, so there's a couple of things we'd like to note. So first of all, thank you. This is beautifully done again. This condition looks to us very quickly like a little bit like what's going on at Kelly right now, and where we have to do the two crossings, and we have to. I know there isn't a stop sign, but it's really challenging for the pedestrian. I think this would be nice for the car. We see that. I appreciate the planning intent of maintaining the historic Main Street alignment. I personally thought that the new alignment was going to create a new, really a new arrival sequence onto Main, because you're turning and you're experiencing Main downtown as you make your left turn approach onto Main Street. I do understand though that comment, but I'm worried about having two crosswalks like this because of Kelly. So I want to share that, and I think it's pretty far down the road in our design. Yeah.
Since this is the first time we're really seeing this project, I'm not really very impressed of how far along things are or what money we may or may not have, considering this is an intersection that's going to be here a lot longer than I am, and how it's going to look and how it impacts people. And I truly wish I had given this, had this thought 2 or 3 weeks ago, so it could be a chance for you to kind of ponder it more and point out where I really didn't think something through correctly.
One other issue that you should consider is this is a very high-speed highway, and if you wanted to come to a stop for the stopping sight distance, we may not have enough distance for, if you're going 50 miles an hour, to come to a stop and still be safe and not be backed up.
How is that
by a
different than
previous
when they're
car.
coming to the signal?
Right, so.
I mean, it's the same distance. It's not.
Right, but what happens is, if we're creating another lane here and people coming to a stop, then there's the issue of sight distance, because this is a curvature as opposed to a straight line. And there's some requirements for Caltrans, so we have to take that into account. And like Jill mentioned, you know, we're so far ahead with getting this peer approval, and it's taking us forever for Caltrans approval, that going back to drawing board is going to set this back many, many months.
Risking being argumentative, this came to my mind because of how this is going to look. So we're going to have an intersection that looks like Stevens Creek Boulevard, and that's going to be the welcome to Half Moon Bay. And that's not your doing, you know, it's happened through time where it's, you know, we just made basic assumptions. So, and that's what's in my mind is this is really the gateway to this part of I've been hearing from a lot of folks that they want some kind of gateway here, and I'm thinking, well, it's going to be hard to do that with signs and monuments, because it's the intersection that's going to be the gateway. Otherwise, I wouldn't be suggesting this at all, you know, in this forum. You know, I don't.
Les, did you have any other comments?
I think the comments that both Jimmy and Brian added as far as you know, what we might want to see down the road, I think those are certainly appropriate for this. I mean, I think at this point, given the amount of traffic that I see, and I bike this area, I think it's sort of like putting lipstick on a pig. I don't think it's going to have, you know, it's not going to do anything right now. I mean, it may, if there's a Hyatt hotel there in the future, or there's more development in the area. But given the fact that it's fairly rural at this point in time, I agree that it certainly will improve safety for those people that use it. But again, given my experience, I see hardly anybody ever crossing the street there. And, you know, I see bikes there, but again, it's not a very highly used bike area. I think in the future, I also like Brian's comment as far as people that use Higgins for biking. Would be nice to see a staging area up there. Now, just, I guess, a question as far as Half Moon Bay property, city property, does it go past the Johnson House? So is Higgins up to the Johnson House part of the city, Half Moon Bay? Okay, but is Higgins, is the road part of Half Moon Bay? It
No.
is? No?
No.
That's
It's a
county?
county
Okay,
road.
all right.
Johnson House's own property is owned by the city, but it's still within unincorporated county
Okay, all right.
lands, all the way. It's all unincorporated.
All right. Thank you. Again, I want to reiterate, I think the items added are appropriate for this project, so.
So, just big picture, stepping back, this is going to make a major improvement to traffic for cars moving along. It may create some interesting new challenges because now you're adding a pedestrian access point, a bike access point, and increasingly, which is nice, we're starting to see more and more people bike and walk around town. And so I know as a civil engineer responsible for traffic safety, you're going to be very focused on making sure whatever we do is something that doesn't repeat mistakes in the past. We learned from Church and Main Street, that intersection. We learned from Poplar and Highway 1, some of the challenges we've had there. I'm sure that you're going to look at that. As we look forward to John's idea about this road that's been here for 150 years, you know, it's an organic road that grew up. The original historic Highway 1 was Main Street. As we think about the bicycle path, the East Side Highway Trail, thinking about aligning that to the historic visual sign, I think as a car, you're probably not going to enjoy it as much as a bicyclist who's coming along Highway 1. So consider that as part of the future design, is maybe instead of pushing that eastward trail right along Highway 1, we push it down Main Street, or let it split down Main Street so you have an option there. That might be something I'd consider or think about. I agree. I mean, I'm going to actually open up for a question back to you. I assume you're going to plan some Opticon light control for the traffic? Okay, so there's no need to condition that. I do like the idea of having either the final review for the trails and sidewalks either come back to the Bike and Pedestrian Committee or the Planning Commission. I don't really care which, but I'd like to see one of the public authorities, public boards, if you will, take a look at this and just give final feedback on a plan. And I think it'd be a really great thing for the Bike and Pedestrian Committee to have something to sink their teeth into and really get as excited as we get about planning stuff. So happy to let them do that. Agree with Jimmy's concerns about a staging area for Isha. You know, we don't want to stage on Ishas, and we want to make sure that we think through that. I do agree we should consider exclusion fencing as a condition of approval. I would like to see the final design outside of the window, getting back to the window dressing. I would like to see the window dressing come back to the Planning Commission for review as part of the architectural review. I agree with Brian's feedback around, let's think about that bike staging area for Johnson House, and as we think through the Purisima Trail and the 2001 master plan for trails for San Mateo County, we should be thinking about how are we eventually going to work with the county to direct traffic down that way. And I think that's the Johnston House is a perfect area for bike staging because it's far removed from Highway 1. I'm very concerned about the drop-off to an unimproved street area. I've seen this on the east side of Highway 1 and Poplar Street. I walk there every day during the week when I'm in town, and it's really something that needs to be thought through. How do we protect pedestrians, you know, because it's, you know, using concrete islands, using all of the tools at your disposal as a planning engineer. Please think through those things, because that is high-speed intersection, pedestrians and bicyclists. It's my biggest concern with this project. I would like to see us underground the utilities if we can to save money and do it as part of one project. It's always the ideal. And if we could at least get some kind of stab at a comprehensive design, like think through, back to the point that John was making earlier, if this is a gateway, are there some things we can do to make this feel like a gateway? Like maybe put the pedestrian access and the bike access as a raised area that goes over Highway 1. I don't know. And maybe that destroys the view. Maybe it's not something we want, but this is the gateway. So maybe thinking about, should the pedestrian access be raised over Highway 1 versus, you eliminate pedestrian risk altogether. I don't know. These are questions for you to consider. And maybe when you bring it back to the Bike and Pedestrian Committee, it's something you can think through. Overall, it's an improvement over what we have today, so it's a step forward. I would have loved to have seen a traffic circle like they have in Carmel, Highway 17 Mile Drive. That would be nice, but I don't think we're up for another 5 to 10 years of planning to get there. John?
I just had a question since the slide is up here. The greenish color area that's got the purple running through it, is all of that in Caltrans right-of-way?
I believe you talk about the corner.
Yeah, that green blob there, yeah.
I don't believe all of that is Caltrans. Some of it is probably within the city right-of-way, but we will check that during the final design and do the final survey, because this is just done an aerial survey at the moment.
So the part that's in, but some of it's clearly in the Caltrans.
Correct.
Yeah. So the stuff that's in the Caltrans right of way, what's the kind of process that you would go through for putting anything in there, other than, I don't know. I mean, how does that work where it's not?
So
city,
So Caltrans issues an encroachment permit. So we will go through the process of getting a peer approval. That's the permit evaluation process. That anything less than $3 million, you can go through the streamlined process, which still takes, it's taken us a long time, but it's faster than creating a project study report. So you submit that, and based on the Caltrans requirement, you will tell whether this meets the requirement, or are you asking for an exception?
Mm-hmm.
So anything that we're doing here, for example, in terms of the site distances, the length of the lanes, the width of the lanes, the shoulders, etc., if it complies with the Caltrans manual, then they would approve it. If it doesn't, before they issue the permit, you would request an exception. Just like for the city, when you have an exception, something that's not according to the city policies. So you go through the exception process in order to get approval. Once that exceptions have been approved, then they would go ahead through the process of approving the actual encroachment permit.
So things like walkways, benches, signs, any of that would go through that
Everything.
encroachment permit? And does that
Everything.
encroachment permit mean like the ones we have in the city where if the Caltrans decides they need to do something there, then whatever's there gets taken out?
That's correct.
Yeah, okay.
Everything, even if you want to put a sign on a Caltrans right-of-way,
Right.
you have to get a permit.
So, okay, and we don't know exactly how much of that green blob is
We
Caltrans
will-
and how much is us, so.
Right, right. So at the moment, we included everything in here, and Caltrans has been mostly concerned. Most of their issues are with the lanes, the length of the lanes, the width of the lanes,
Sure.
etc.
Sure. And then, is there water in this area for any of these landscaping?
There will, that would be determined as part of the final design, obviously, but usually you have to put, I mean, you have landscaping, you have an initial period establishment, and you have to provide water. You either have to provide a truck watering system, or you have to put a sprinkler system until they get established. But we will try to put, plants that don't require too much water, but during the establishment period, they would need water, yes.
So that infrastructure is part of the cost that the
Correct.
city and the county is paying
That's
for
correct.
with their budgets, yeah. Great, thank you.
Through the chair.
Please.
So, I appreciated your comment about the bicycle and pedestrian trails committee chewing on, getting their teeth onto the design of the locations of those things, and I also support your and Brian's view that the Johnston House would be a logical basis for excursions, as well as the path to nowhere cautionary tale that we want to avoid. And maybe they can do the bike and ped stuff, but I really want to get the benefit of John weighing in again on the details of the design. Every time he looks at an intersection, when he was saying, the real gateway are the valleys and the hills and the things, I mean, that really spoke to me. And I hope that we'll get a chance to hear him look at that design and bring that same design ethos to his thinking, to our thinking. I think we'll benefit from that. So I hope we'll get a chance to look at the design again without feeling too overly helicopter planning commission kind of attitude. It did occur to me that if we're successful in reducing the accidents that happen next to the fire station because of people getting creamed or coming down too fast, we're actually going to hurt the metric of their response time to accidents. So there's a potential negative impact, but that's the only one I could think of. With that,
For the record, the fire department is waving that off as not a concern.
not a significant concern. So with that in mind, I would like to make a motion.
Please.
I move that we adopt the resolution C 2017-09 with the additions of review of the alignment of the bike pedestrian routes by the Bike and Pedestrian Committee, and review of the dressing designed by the Planning Commission, with coastal development, also with attention to consistency with the bike and pedestrian improvements in the adjacent areas, both in the city and with strong encouragement to the county for providing for a connection to allow our cyclists to get to establish excursions starting at the Johnston House. And exclusionary fencing, the usual coastal development, the usual California Natural Diversity Database, and monitoring for the area that is adjacent to sensitive habitat in the project area. Let's see. With attention to the review of the design for protection from accidents resulting from blindness from sun or headlight blindness. I think that's it. Any amendments?
Any amendments? I have none.
Second.
We'll pause for a second. Do you have any other amendments?
I just had a question. I think what I heard you say was that condition, in our packet, condition 8, condition 9, and condition 20 would come back to us for review. That's lighting, landscaping, and gateway signage.
Thank you for saving me from looking those up. That would certainly be in the list, yes.
I'll second that.
Lots of seconds.
Can I get a voice, can I get a roll call vote, please?
Commissioner Evans,
Yes.
Commissioner Benjamin,
Yes.
Commissioner DeMann,
Yes.
Vice Chair Holt,
Yes.
and Chair Hernandez.
Yes.
Motion passes.
This item's closed. Thank you for this great staff report and for your patience with us. Appreciate it.
Mr. Chair? Take
Yes, please.
Could I take 30 seconds? One, thank you for your consideration and for the time and effort you've taken. I don't believe, and I think I was remiss during the public comment period to congratulate Jill for her appointment officially, and I think this is the first Planning Commission meeting since her official appointment as the Community Development Director. So I wanted to take that opportunity before I left the room to congratulate her and ask you to do the same. So thank you.
Well, it's my great pleasure to have you be our Community Development Director. I know a lot of responsibility falls on your shoulders, off of John's and onto yours, and we welcome your contribution. So thank you. Congratulations. What I'd like to do is take a 5-minute break, just so everybody can reconvene, and we need to sort through a few things. So we'll break for 5 minutes.
Congratulations.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm absolutely mortified and delighted at the same time.
Careful what you wish for.
Jimmy's got all the reservations. I don't know what you're talking about. Paging Dr. Benjamin, paging Dr. Benjamin. Okay, I'd like to reconvene, please. So we have the next item on our agenda is the project, get the address here, on
Pullman Street,
Pullman Street.
782 Pullman Avenue.
There we go. 2782 Pullman Avenue. Jill?
So Scott Phillips is going to give you the presentation, and then you'll notice that you have a few extra materials before you, and so when he completes that, I'll review the overview of what those are. We had a few items come in later this afternoon. Thank you.
Thanks, Jill. Chair and members of the Planning Commission. This project involves the construction of a new residence and sewer line extension on the south end of Pullman Avenue, the dead end there. In particular, the house would be a two-story design, craftsman inspired, totaling 1,818 square feet, and it would include a one-car garage and a reverse floor plan with the main living space on the second story. Sewer line extension and sidewalk improvements would take place along the Pullman Avenue right-of-way. The permits requested include a coastal development permit, architectural review, parking exception for the reduced garage parking, and two variances to allow for building encroachment into the side yard setback as well as the rear yard setback. We did receive some questions on the noticing that was required for this project. And as required by our code, the site was posted last June, earlier this year in June, when a complete coastal development permit application was filed. Notice of intent to adopt the draft CEQA document was posted at the county clerk's office, City Hall, and sent to all the adjacent neighbors. We also published an ad in the HMB Review and notice to all the neighbors for this meeting tonight. The site itself is on the southern end of Pullman Avenue and is currently vacant. Pullman Ditch runs along the south end of the property. The surrounding neighborhood, as you can see on this slide, is sort of a mixture of developed and undeveloped sites. The Stolowski subdivision improvements are currently under construction to the south of the subject property. Some key points for the Planning Commission to consider: biological resources assessment, compliance with our local coastal program, adequacy of the CEQA document, and I'll go into detail on each of these. In regard to the biological resource assessment, as required by our code, the biological resource assessment was prepared and circulated for 45 days. Copies of the report circulated to other government agencies for comments. During that comment period, we only received feedback from the Regional Water Quality Control Board in an email form with wanting a little more detail on the project scope and the distance of the required buffer. We provided the information to the water board, and they seemed satisfied with that, and no comments were received from the Coastal Commission. The biological resource assessment did identify the presence of San Francisco dusky-footed wood rat within the study area, which is a species of special concern, and the possibility of presence of California red-legged frog in the Pullman ditch as an uncommon dispersant. Since those findings were included, the biologist also included or recommended mitigation measures, which then initiated the need for the preparation of an initial study and draft mitigated negative declaration for compliance with CEQA. This slide shows the Pullman ditch in blue as it relates to the subject property in green. As you can notice, there is a jog in the ditch as you go towards the back of the property. You can use the laser sighter. So this is Pullman Avenue here, and the ditch itself jogs back closer to the side property line here. Normally our code requires, or I should back up, the biological resource assessment identified the Pullman ditch as an intermittent stream, and no riparian vegetation was identified in the report. Given that, normally a 30-foot buffer is required from the center line of an intermittent stream with no riparian vegetation. As you can see, that would leave just the orange area here left over for development of a single-family residence, which is clearly insufficient width for such undertaking. Our code does allow for, in certain circumstances, to reduce the 30-foot buffer to 20 feet from the center line of the ditch, as indicated in the purple line here. The location of the drainage feature on the subject property is considered an exceptional circumstance that limits the development of the potential of the property, and thus the findings for the requested variances and parking exception can reasonably be made. The blue line, as I indicated earlier, and the location of the Pullman ditch varying as it goes back to the end of the property, provides the widest portion of the property towards the rear, which the new house as designed utilizes this unique jog and places a wider portion of the house in the back of the property. The design itself is tastefully done and is somewhat similar to the construction or the design of the house that was recently constructed to the west on Champs-Élysées. Minor differences include siding, color, and roof elements. I provided a color and material sample that you're welcome to take a look at. This slide indicates the side elevations, and notice that there's a a limited amount of windows on the north elevation here. Part of that is to respect the privacy of the adjacent house to the north, but yet also provide interesting building articulation with the offset second story, as well as a few shed dormers. The south elevation, as you can see, includes more windows and to take advantage of the natural light to the south, as well as the cypress trees and more interesting views to the south. A detailed landscape plan was also included in the plan set, and we've provided a memorandum that where we're recommending an additional condition of approval to be added, stating that the biologist review the plant lists included in the landscape plan to verify that there wouldn't be any sort of impact on the sensitive habitat in the area. In regard to hazards, there has been we did receive some feedback from some residents on the potential flooding in the area, and similar to 2805 Champs-Élysées, a geotechnical report will be required to be approved during the building permit review. The site is within flood zone X, which is not considered a floodplain. The house would be a pier construction, and the project itself would also be required to comply with the NPDES requirements for stormwater management. In conclusion, the unique circumstance that applies to the property justifies the requested variances and parking exception. And given the narrowness of the lot and the location of the Pullman ditch, the 6 findings can be made for the reduction of the 30-foot normal buffer requirement. The draft initial study and mitigated negative declaration was prepared and circulated for the required 20 days, and no comments were received. Generally speaking, the house is well designed and in compliance with the residential design guidelines. During this whole process, we did receive 2 letters from surrounding property owners, one in support, the homeowner at 2805, and then another letter from the homeowner to the north with some concerns with the project. When we Planning Commission was forwarded that letter, and I also reached out to the subject property owner and suggested that he reach out to the adjacent neighbor, which they did. And last I heard, they have worked out some of the concerns. They're both here this evening, and I think they're prepared to address the concerns. In conclusion, staff is supportive of the project. I would be happy to answer any questions.
John, I'll start with you.
Before you begin, I'd like to add to the record briefly. So Scott made reference to this memorandum. You have 4 things in front of you, and I'd like to just quickly note what they are. This first one is a strike-through underline revision of the conditions of approval that were drafted as part of your Exhibit B to the resolution. And you'll note that the biologist review of the landscape plan is up front. It's number 6, and then there were a couple other minor changes, one with regards to the building code and the version of the building code, and a few other things that we're trying to update in our standard conditions of approval. The next one is a document regarding fencing. It was a fence study for exclusion fencing for special status species that was conducted at 2805, the property to the west that Scott referred to. And the reason why we provided this is because we received additional comments about the history of this area in terms of different projects on different sites along the Pullman ditch, and the different biological assessments that were conducted, different conclusions that have been made, and input that has been received from various agencies. So first, the third item is an email from the Sierra Club regarding the buffer zone and concerns about some of the historic studies in the area, as well as a note about flooding. And then the next piece is an excerpt of about a 50-page report. It was for a house that was proposed and I believe is now built immediately to the north of the subject site at 2780, it should be 2789. You'll see the address is 2788. This is a, 86, excuse me, thank you, 86. Thank you. This was the Coastal Commission report. This was a project that was approved by the city and appealed to the Coastal Commission a few years ago. What you have is just an excerpt of the report. It has a cover sheet and 4 letters from agencies regarding findings of their concerns, and frankly the Coastal Commission found substantial issue with regards to their concerns about the buffer and habitat in the area. And then we've also added on the back, this appeal was actually withdrawn at a later date when it was agreed to have exclusion fencing as part of the approval. Now, back to that number 2, we provided this Coast Range study of the western property, which happened subsequently, and they had a different opinion about the effectiveness and purpose for this kind of fencing. So it's a challenge for us to think about tonight, but we wanted to add these pieces to the record because they came up late this afternoon, and wanted to make sure you had those before you.
Thanks, Jill. Please.
Have I been off all that time? I'm sorry. So the idea was that it cited a number of decisions that had been made in that area over the years that were considered by the Coastal Commission. And as Jill pointed out, the home that is adjacent to the site that is under consideration this evening was approved by the city and then appealed to the Coastal Commission. The Coastal Commission made a finding of substantial issue, so they adopted findings that identified habitat in that area. It also, and that appeal, by the way, was subsequently withdrawn, but of course that doesn't affect the findings that they adopted for substantial issue. They still exist and are citable as a matter of fact. In addition, there was a reference to the Stolosky project in the letter from the Sierra Club, so I went back to have a look at that document, and it raised a question for me as well. In the section of the drainage, the Pullman watercourse that is adjacent to Highway 1, in the study, I think you had a map up. If you could go back, Jill, to the, thank you. The one where we had a map of the area that showed, yeah, that one right there. So the green area that's adjacent, that's sort of somewhat adjacent to the watercourse, is identified here as Monterey Pine Cypress. Monterey Pine is a protected species. It's a rare plant under the city's zoning ordinance. And I want to be sure that the intention of the draft revision is to protect that species as well as any other, or if there are any special buffer requirements that we need to be aware of with respect to Monterey Pine in that area.
Mr. Chair, if I could address that concern.
Please.
We did add tree protection measures as a condition of approval, and that includes the trees that are on the south side of the Pullman ditch. It was actually one of the, I forgot to mention this, with the Regional Water Quality Control Board they requested that the condition be added as well to protect the trees on the south side of the ditch.
Yeah, that also, I think that the pines are also considered a significant plant resource with respect to the visual resource, which makes this a visually sensitive area. Am I mistaken?
Yeah, I'm not sure on that.
Okay, I could be wrong. I noticed in the Stolosky 2007 report that it was identified as being Monterey pine, so that was why it caught my eye. The bottom line, colleagues, is that I feel like there's a project, there's a home here that someone wants to build, and they have a right to have a home in this location. But the relevant information about what are the protections and restrictions that we should be honoring are not clear because we don't have the full history in this area. I feel like the record isn't quite right for us to make a decision about this. I'm supportive, but I want to be sure we have the right information about the plants, the right information about the habitat, and in particular, the distinction between the ones that different biologists might or might not have agreed with, and those that were part of findings that have been adopted by the Coastal Commission, because I think those carry more weight. And that information is not in our packet, but it's present, and it's been identified by the letter and cited by reference through this announcement of ex parte information. So my feeling is that we ought to hear it, we ought to learn about it, but we ought to get all of that information together and then bring it back for what will hopefully be a quick decision once we have the full body of information in front of us. Thank you.
Brian?
So the subject property is 2782 Pullman Avenue. The information that we just received on Coastal Commission and the sort of past issues in the area was listed as 2788 Pullman Avenue. Are you able to point out the location? I don't know if this is the right figure, but it's, I gather, north of. So that would be that one. The one directly to the north. Okay. Thank you. That's my only question.
John?
No questions.
Les?
So in reference to Jimmy's questions, can you go over what added mitigation things were added to the changes to the draft condition of approval?
So the substantive added condition of approval includes reviewing the landscape plan, having the landscape plan reviewed by the biologist before issuing the building permit. And what the biologist would be doing is looking for invasive species or anything that would negatively impact the area, and requesting changes if need be to the landscape plan.
Second question I have, is this project appealable to the Coastal Commission?
Yes, the subject property is within the appeals jurisdiction, and the reason for that is that it's west of the first through street. So there is not a through street to the west of the subject property.
Thank you.
Scott, I wonder if you or the city wish to respond to the comments or the comments that Jimmy made?
Certainly. So the question in particular was in relation to the Monterey Pines if I'm hearing correctly, and whether or not it's considered a protected species, right?
I mean, I know that's not controversial. The questions from my perspective are, what are the elements of the history of findings of habitat in this site that are relevant to the decision-making in front of the commission this evening? And do we have that information tonight?
Well, I think Jill touched upon it a little bit, that there has been a sort of a varying opinion on different projects within the vicinity. You know, the one most recently to the south, or to the west, I should say, 2805 Champs-Élysées, and this one, the biological work that took place resulted in you know, that this really isn't prime habitat for you know, protected species. That there is a possibility of you know, red-legged frogs and you know, as an uncommon dispersant, but there really, I mean, reading through the reports, that there is no possibility of San Francisco garter snake or other protected species from inhabiting the area. That's why you can see that there wasn't any mitigation measures associated with you know, snakes. There were some for the frogs, but and those were consistent with what was found on the Stolowski project to the south. The one sort of curveball was with the project to the north at 2786 Pullman, where there was mitigation measures and the requirement for one-way exclusionary fencing, and that condition did remain with the project. The appeal was ultimately withdrawn, appeal that was filed by the Coastal Commission and ultimately withdrawn by the Coastal Commission. The condition did remain, and the fencing did get put in. I actually finalized it myself, and that was part of the you know, issuance of the certificate of occupancy for the house. Jill did point out that the analysis on the fencing, there was extensive discussion by the Planning Commission with 2805 Champs-Élysées on whether or not it was appropriate to have fencing along the side of that house adjacent to the creek. And the evidence that was provided was to the contrary, that it would actually create more harm than it would prevent impacts. So ultimately, the Planning Commission decided that you know, exclusionary fencing was not appropriate, you know, along the Pullman ditch. So I don't know if I directly answered your question, but hopefully that provided some feedback and background.
Did any of the decisions, other than the one on the property just adjacent and to the north of the subject parcel for tonight, were any of the, I know that one has findings that were adopted by the Coastal Commission that remain in effect, that are part of the finding of substantial issue, regardless of whether the appeal went forward or was withdrawn. The statement of findings was found and it was not withdrawn, the statement of substantial issue. And so the question is, were the decisions in these other areas, did they go to the Coastal Commission? Stolowski did, but the Coastal Commission declined to take jurisdiction of Stolowski. So did the Coastal Commission actually make decisions about any of these other parcels?
Not to my knowledge. It was, at least in the general vicinity, 2786 Pullman Avenue, and then the subdivision on Stolowski sites. And the biological resource assessment that was provided to the Planning Commission tonight did touch upon some of the, you know, what took place during the review of the Stolowski subdivision, and ultimately the conclusion that was made that, you know, the site itself does not contain you know, a high level of biological diversity, or is you know, doesn't contain, you know, sensitive habitat to the point where it's, there would be any substantial, you know, any impact. And that's ultimately part of the decision why they concluded that there was not a substantial issue.
And in the Stolowski project, they also identified, if I'm not mistaken, the portion of the Pullman watercourse that is to the east of the subject parcel, that is basically from Highway 1 down to Pullman, as a perennial stream. Is that correct? Perennial riparian corridor?
The conclusion that's been made is that it's intermittent. That
At the time of the Stolowski project?
I believe it was intermittent. But
Let me just double check.
we would have to double check just to verify.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. I have no further questions. I think what I'm trying to get to is that I don't think the record is clear.
So, we have a couple of things we need to do as part of this project. One is to, you know, there's some clarifications that may need to occur. As a point of order, do we want to put a hold on that for a moment and talk about the design itself?
The Chair, I'd love to have the public hearing. People have come, they want to speak, I want to hear. And ultimately, I know there's an important project that somebody cares about that I want to see get built here. But our record needs to be right, our process needs to be.
I think that
Thank you.
that's a fair consideration and it's appropriate. So typically for these types of projects, we give the architect or the applicant an opportunity to present the project themselves and not just have city staff do that. If you'd like to, I'd be happy to avail you of that. And for the record, please state your name.
Microphone.
Okay. Is that better? All right, great. So I recently purchased the property, and the plans had already been submitted, and been working with Scott, and I've pretty much researched everything and gone through all the letters that were submitted to the city. I spoke with the Coastside County Water District. The water's available for both fire and for domestic use. I spoke to the Granada Community Services District about the sewer extension. I have the applications. Obviously, I'm not going to submit them until we have an approval. And I reviewed the letter about fire, what we need to do to accommodate when we build. And in reference to any letters from the neighbors, Mr. Kurt Krieger is the neighbor to the north, and he happens to be here. We met last night for the first time. We went over the plans together. Pretty much, I believe, his concerns were taken care of, and he's willing to comment. We also have some neighbors in the audience. John and Sandy Paoli are here in support of the project. The neighbors to the south, Mark and Teresa Stolowski, support the project. The neighbors to the west, Vic and Susan, also support the project. That's all I really have to comment on. If you have any questions for me specifically, I'd be glad to answer.
Thank you. Are there any questions for the applicant? I will, maybe the design wasn't something you put together, but I will comment that it incorporates a lot of interesting design elements from buildings around Half Moon Bay. I was struck by how similar it is to the railroad house on the corner of Poplar and Railroad. It's very similar in design, massing, and so forth. So it has a lot of very similar elements. So it's an interesting interesting.
I also like the design very much. Thank you.
Okay, I have a couple of comment cards here. So, Kurt Krieger, followed by Sandy Powley.
Good evening, I'm Kurt Krieger. My wife Kathy and I are the owner occupants of the property just to the north. It's 2786, but the document you have says 2788. I think it's the same house. When we first saw the sign posted back in June that Mr. Phillips referred to, we were shocked that anyone could build on that property because it's so close to that creek, and with the 5-foot setbacks and everything, we couldn't see how you could have a house there. So I went into Mr. Phillips' office and I said, I don't understand how anyone could build here. And he said, oh yes, you can. We can build there, and it's likely to be approved. And at that point I said, okay, could I see the plans? And so we looked at the plans together, and I agree it was a lovely design, and it didn't seem, visually from our side, it wouldn't be a problem, and we felt okay about it, and didn't say anything. And then returned home from a business trip and saw the story poles, if I said that right, and to my eye, they were completely different than the plan that we had reviewed in Mr. Phillips' office, because it seemed to be just a wall along the entire length of the property. And I thought, whoa, that's not the plan I saw. So wrote the email to Mr. Phillips saying that we weren't pleased with the change in the design. And then Dominic, I'm sorry, I don't know, I mispronounced your last name, I won't even try, came over last night and showed me that it was exactly the same plans. And so with the understanding that any changes to the plans would require another hearing that we could have a chance to speak at, we would withdraw any objection that we would have to the property.
Thank you.
And just want to make 2 comments, I guess inappropriate comments. Our fence does have the little holes, and I didn't know what that was called until tonight, so I appreciate that. And did you know that when they extended Pullman across, they tore down 3 or 4 of those trees that were along the line there? They're beautiful trees, and when they extended the Pullman to where they're going to build a cul-de-sac and they've started that fence, they tore down 3 or 4 of those. Thank you.
Thank you. Sandy? Hopefully I didn't butcher your name too badly.
Sandy Paoli. We own both 2789 and 2793 Pullman Avenue. And we have, when our permit process were before several of you who have clearly been on this commission a long time. We are in support of his project. And by the way, we own the vacant lot is going to be before you for a project in the near future as well. That is our vacant lot next to 2789. We've been at this long enough to be sensitive to that it is called a ditch, not a creek, not a ditch. We are in support of his project, and what I want to comment is what I've appreciated out of reading his package, and even the concerns brought maybe tonight, is these frogs, etc., whatever they could be that we've never seen once, are thrust upon us as homeowners. And what the time when it was approached to cover that ditch instead, which was denied, you can see the challenges to any property owner and their rights to construct something. So something brought before you that will allow this man opportunity to have property rights instilled, what I'm at least appreciating that I'm hearing is the voice of reason through this. If you have a concern, so be it. Gee, I'm really sorry it couldn't, for his sake, get handled tonight, because we sat through way too long of these meetings ourselves to accomplish the building of a home that you just want to do. But at least I'm hearing a voice of reason to get to the finish line for him. If one thing needs to be addressed, just work with it and help this man accomplish his goal, because I don't know when, but we'll be right back at you for our vacant lot as well in short order. So thank you.
Thank you, and good luck with your process. Okay, I have no other public comment cards. I don't see anybody else racing to the lectern to add comments, so I'm going to close public comment. Direct it back to the Planning Commission for discussion. start?
Go ahead.
Or John? Go ahead, John.
I don't know if it was intentional or not, but I'm really happy to see that this house is really environmentally pretty responsive. Actually, the windows are facing the way they ought to get good heat gain. And if I don't know who's going to be, if you're going to be living there or if someone else is living there, but you're going to enjoy that. You're going to not have a huge heating bill because that south-facing glass is going to really make that house nice and warm all of the time. So that part's great. It was a difficult site, and we probably need to discuss another time as a commission trying to develop a policy, because there are some lots in our town that are next to these ditches that have become protected waterways. And so the only reason you're here before us is because of these exceptions that are required from our standard ordinances of setbacks and lot coverage and stuff. I'm really happy to see that you're doing a drilled pier project, because concrete slab there would be really difficult in the long run for you. And I mean, the uplift of the soil, the house doesn't weigh as much as the soil pushing up on it. And the drilled piers are really a great, you'll really appreciate that going forward. And that's my only comments.
Les?
No, we approved 2805 Champs-Élysées, so I'm trying to figure out why we wouldn't want to approve 2782 Pullman, assuming it meets whatever the same criteria is as far as distance from the ditch. I think the only other issues that I have is just making sure that when we approve the variances, that they are the ones that we are required to approve. If there's any other way to position the house. Also, I noticed that on the plan, I guess some of the landscaping encroaches onto the buffer zone, and I'm just curious how that works out. I mean, there's are they the rules allow the homeowner to landscape that, or is that completely off limits?
And Mr. Chair, if I could elaborate on that, it's
Please.
The homeowner would be allowed to plant, native drought-tolerant, plants that are, normally associated with a drainage water course such as this. But any, structures, for instance, fencing or garden shed, things of that nature would not be allowed within the buffer.
Before I hand it off to Brian and Jimmy, I'm just going to make a couple of comments myself. Appreciate the design, the contrasting colors you have. I would encourage you, if you go on Google Maps or Google Street View, you can take a look at Railroad and Poplar. It's been yellow, it's been blue. You might consider looking at those two colors for your house. It might give you, it's worth taking the time to consider that, just because the design you have is so similar. You may or may not agree, but that's a consideration. On the west elevation of the house, the second floor window, you might consider making that window larger, because you're going to be facing out, you're going to have a fantastic view, and the way it's currently designed, you're not really going to take advantage of that view, potentially. So the east side is amazing. You're going to get morning light. It should be really wonderful. But on the west elevation, I'd consider, if I were you, if I were building a home here, what's that going to look out onto, and is, it may add considerable value to your wife's perspective into which house she wants to live in. So I'd consider that. Brian?
Yeah, I don't necessarily have a lot of comments on the design, and in general, I'm somebody who appreciates and values the opinions of experts and generally relies on those opinions. But I do have to say on this particular one, getting information at the last minute, I'm uncomfortable moving the project forward without. I think Jimmy makes a good point that there is very likely a project here, a viable project here, and something that that we should consider. But right now, I feel like I'm looking at piecemeal information and don't necessarily have the entirety of the record in terms of what's happened in other areas and that sort of thing. So that's where I'm at. Like I say, I don't have huge concerns on the house or the structure or the design, but I do want to make sure that in the interest in transparency and ensuring that we're doing our due diligence and not moving into an approval that's just going to kick this into another situation that's potentially problematic. I would support continuing this to make sure that we build up the record and the narrative and be able to bring that back and have that conversation.
So, I like the house, not that that's important, because we approve things we don't like if they conform. We reject things that we do like if they don't conform. But it's a beautiful house, and it's adjacent to a stream. I live adjacent to a stream, so I can sympathize with you. I'm actually worried a little bit about the extent to which the cumulative amount of development adjacent to the stream feels like it's becoming another Kehoe with its attendant challenges. So, I think that cumulative impact is that's not something that the city should hang on you, in my opinion. But I think it's something that as a city, as a planning agency, knowing the history of Pullman flooding in front of the last row of homes, the ones before Naples, and knowing the amount of erosion behind the last homes on Naples, I feel like our planning process has failed this neighborhood with respect to that creek. And our revisions need to find a way to address that. It was a challenge for you. It was a challenge for Honor. I assume that I'm the person that you were referring to when you said that you saw familiar faces. I was away from the Planning Commission for a few years, so I'm back. But I do believe that there are ways to resolve this problem. And so the concerns I've raised tonight, I want to be very clear, are not about your home, or about your home, or about your home. It's about our process. Someone's on the record expressing concerns that the record's incomplete. We need to see the rest of the record so that we can make an assessment. And at least for me, it's really that simple. With respect to the safety and erosion, I understand that this creek is entirely in private property. I'm guessing that the city has an easement for drainage in the creek, or what easements do we have, yes? I think I remember seeing that, and it's newly granted, or it has pre-existing.
If I could elaborate on that, there is no, the city does not have an easement currently for the Pullman ditch. And what we've asked for and added a draft condition of approval is for an irrevocable offer for the drainage easement in the case of emergency, that the city could eventually record that easement. But at this, the city doesn't accept the easement at this time.
And how wide an easement are we asking for?
20 foot.
20 feet. From the outer edge of the property, 20 feet. So it's the full size of the setback. Actually, it's a little less than that now that I think about it, since it's 20 feet from the middle of the intermediate of the water course. Remind me where the 20 feet is.
The entire ditch. So.
Okay. Do we need, does the city feel that it needs any additional indemnification isn't the right word, disclaimer, there's a legal word, some kind of protection from the potential that erosion or flooding could eventually harm a project that's being approved here? Or are our boilerplate conditions sufficient for us to feel that we can manage that risk?
Jill and I have discussed that with our engineering staff, and it is private property at the end of the day, so we do feel that this is sufficient, what's written in right now, so.
I see. Thank you. No further questions, Chair.
As I look at this project, I'm just struck by potential parallel to what's happening with Seymour Creek, Seymour Ditch, Seymour Canyon. I think it's outside of the scope of what we're doing for this project, but there was clearly a substantial change in the drainage patterns at Seymour, and it's led to erosion. There's public comment from experts to that effect. And so as I'm looking at a map of, a Google map of the area here, it's a concern that I have from a bigger picture planning perspective. Are we, there's a parking lot there, it's a beach access point, the coastal trail goes right there. I think there's I can't recall if there's a bridge of some kind there, a little, I think the creek has a little bridge over there. But it's just a bigger picture perspective question for us to consider. I think directionally, to avoid unnecessary litigation and kind of questions that may come up, I'd like to make sure that we have the full record in front of us, so I support a continuation as well. So just the point here just being to make sure that we have enough time to review all of the documents and we're not kind of running at this pell-mell without the full view. So could I get a motion? Unless there's any other comments.
Yeah, there are. I mean, I heard Jimmy, I heard you, I heard Brian. I'm not sure what else we're going to see here. I mean, what exactly are we looking at, or do we think we want to see before we go ahead and either approve or not approve the project? So I mean, I heard some kind of vague language here, the record, but I don't know exactly what that is. So I want some more information before I either approve it, disapprove it, yay or nay at this point.
Fair enough. And from my perspective, I don't know that I necessarily need any more information. I just need the information presented more in a sequential and sort of narrative package that kind of tells the story of what's going on in this area, as opposed to, there's this project and this happened back in 2007 and we're being presented that. And so I think to sort of reinforce what Rick just said in terms of concerns over litigation and what Jimmy said in terms of just the building the record, I just think it would be prudent for us to have that information presented in a more comprehensive fashion.
Let me ask a question of staff. Are you confident that you can comply with these issues or these questions that are raised in a way that hopefully will satisfy the questions and issues that we just heard?
I'm gonna go ahead and take that one. We are, provided that we're real clear tonight about what the expectations are, and of course staff is never wanting to give you a stack of 4 handouts at the last minute. We did our best to pull things together at the end of the day. Certainly there's a lot more in the record. We think it can be organized in a way that's helpful to you. But we're focused on the biological assessment topics, properties in and around the area. And I think we have a pretty good idea about what to do with that, but I'm hearing you talk about flooding and erosion. I don't know what your expectations are for that.
I'll speak 'cause I raised the larger picture. I don't think there's anything tied to this project specifically around the erosion of Pullman Ditch. It's more of a bigger picture planning perspective as we're outside of this project. I'm not trying to tie those two things together.
Okay.
I think there's a separate issue that Jimmy has.
Yeah, well, if it wasn't clear in my comments, I want to reassure them, I'm not asking that we, find the additional conditions, saddle this project with additional conditions to resolve all of the flood and erosion risks in this area. It's not like that. But I do think the history of flooding and erosion is pertinent to this decision. The impacts that were both before and after Naples have been pretty substantial off of this drainage. And, to the extent that it informs our understanding of compatibility with policies that protect against those kinds of risks, flooding and erosion. Well, erosion probably won't show up because it's not a natural stream, but flooding does. But I think it's a public service from a point of view of harmonious development, public safety. It makes sense to look at erosion as well. So it's the natural resources in the area as described in coastal development permits, the Paoli permit, the one on Champs-Élysées that Les mentioned, the findings of substantial issue, the one project I'm aware of where the Coastal Commission, who bats last in these things, has made a statement, and Stolowski, where the Coastal Commission chose not to bat, but there were interesting statements made in it as well. So I hope that's clear. How would you like this to be for a date certain?
No, we'd prefer to, because of the holiday, we need a little time to take a look at how to pull this together. I do want to note that there's a hold harmless condition, and I confirmed with our assistant city attorney that she's satisfied with that. So we just wanted to have a more crisp answer about that.
Thank you. I suspected as much, but just wanted to double check. Thank you very much. With that, I move that we continue PDP 17. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry.
You can jump the gun there. Yeah.
John?
I'd like to hear from staff and our council. The question was raised earlier that we've just recently approved a project just to the west of this with certain conditions. If we're adding, how does that weigh in if we start adding different conditions and different requirements than we just did that project to the west?
I'm not sure that you're adding additional conditions right now. I think we're building the record. So I'm not sure where you're going quite yet. We'll find out when we come back. It's a fair question. I think the sites are substantially similar, and yet they may have some nuances that you may see a different condition is required. I continue to be concerned about how we deal with landscaping in buffer areas, for example. So if that was a condition that wasn't applied in 2015, and it comes forward because we've started doing that on other projects. I mean, that happens over time. We're trying to improve our practice. Okay.
I move we continue PDP-15-096 to a date uncertain.
Can I get a second?
Second.
Can I get a roll call vote, please?
Commissioner Evans,
Yes.
Commissioner Benjamin,
Yes.
Commissioner Duban,
Yes.
Vice Chair Holt,
Yes.
and Chair Hernandez.
Yes.
Motion passed. Continued 5-0.
Okay, this hearing item's closed. So I'd like to move to the planning director's report.
It's in there. It's in there, yeah.
Oh, you got 'em?
It's
Okay.
open.
Okay, great. All right, so for this agenda forecast, we want to note that we will pay close attention to the project that you just continued to make sure we can work it in. I think it will come up early in the new year, hopefully in January. So we're going to see you on December 12th. We've talked about this before. It's a joint study session on the Parks Master Plan. We're looking at possibly 2 projects on January 9th. We'll confirm that at your next meeting on December 12th. So do hold that calendar date. We weren't sure if we were going to make it, but we think maybe we can now. You won't see the local coastal land use plan come back probably until February because we have a lot to do. Let's see. We've already reported out on forthcoming director hearings, bicycle and pedestrian master plan recommendations coming up December 7th. The City Council adopted the Planning Commission bylaws on November 21st. We will get the final version to you. The City Council will receive the Measure D report on December 5th. We've discovered now that we owe you an update not only about housing but also Measure D plus public, I guess I'm thinking of sewer and water capacity and et cetera, public facilities. So
Public infrastructure.
yes, all of that. So thank you for that. We have, to close our report here, a few dramatic photos. The Ritz-Carlton Piers project of removing those outer piers is essentially complete. They're removed, the equipment is gone. The biological assessment is underway. That was an after-the-fact study that was required. And the Ritz is working directly with the Coastal Commission staff for their long-term approach to how to deal with this situation, because there's a lot more piers that are still, well, basically entrenched in that hunk of bluff that you see in that picture. These were taken by the contractor. They had a drone go out and do these. Do the last one. Is that, oh, that was the, yeah, okay. So we thought you might like to see how really hard this is. Okay. And that's our report. Thank you.
Thank you. That's quite the project. I don't think I've seen any project move so quickly. So hopefully we get this sorted out longer term. We now move to, thank you, Jill, for that. We move to Planning Commission communications. Do you have any commission?
I just want to mention that my threatened disappearance for surgery next week has been postponed, so you're stuck with me for a little while. I'll let you know when I have an update, but count me in for the December meetings.
Excellent. I'm not going to be here for the December 12th meeting. I will put in a notice at the Hyatt Regency Austin, 208 Barton Springs, Austin, Texas. I will, if you guys are willing to accommodate me, dial in for the study session, and that's the address. I can also email it to you guys. Okay, with that.
With that, I will not be here on the 12th, and given the fact that I have a reception to go to that evening, I don't think I'm going to dial in, so I'd try to go to the reception. Obviously, we're not going to vote on anything, right? So you don't need a quorum? Or do you?
Looks like we have a quorum.
Okay.
It's a joint session. You will have the draft Parks Master Plan, and if you have, after the meeting, feedback, just please provide it to staff. That's fine. You'll miss the discussion, but we still want your input.
Very good. Can I get a motion then?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.